Okay, hello everyone. This is CounterYolo again, bringing you another video in Star Trek Online. And today we are continuing our series of ranking all the starships in my subjective starship tier list. And today's video is going to be covering escorts. I will again, like normal, include my biases and limitations, including the slight changes that I'll be doing for the escort list in particular. And then go through all the ships from best to worst. We covered science vessels earlier this week. Today's is escorts, and next week will be cruisers. The cruiser list is going to be a much longer video. I've got a lot of bashing to do with cruisers, and we'll talk about slight hints as to why at the end of this video. But there will be a TLDR on Reddit as well. It might take me a little bit longer than last time to put it up, just because we have 117 escorts today versus 60 science vessels the last time. So it might take me a little bit longer to do all that. Anyway, feel free to see time links in the description or at the time bar at the bottom of the screen. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Again, just like last time, I have my own biases and limitations. First off, just like last time, this is going to be for PvE playstyles only. And again, because of that, pilot abilities and intelligence abilities will be significantly devalued in this list. And that's because those abilities are more strong in PvP than they are in PvE. And also alongside that, just to start off with, I am a tank captain. As some people were pointing out on Reddit, you know, my bias is towards tanking versus some of the other playstyles. And so if a starship is really good at tanking and maybe a little bit less so in the others, it's going to get a higher rank than what other DPS only players are going to consider for their lists. It also means that durability will be more important for me than maneuverability and mobility for this list in particular. Additionally, flexibility is going to be important more than one particular playstyle. There is going to be a limitation on that, and I'll talk about why in the next slide. But generally speaking, if a starship can be good at a lot of stuff, it will probably be a little bit higher on the list. Additionally, when it comes to specializations, obviously starships with full specializations will get priority over partial in some cases. We do have some interesting situations with escorts that will make some ships, even without primary specializations, actually into high B and A tier. We'll talk about why when we get to those particular ships. But they are weird anomalies that are not common for escorts. They give them extra versatility, which again, flexibility and versatility does increase the rating of starships. So there are going to be a couple of ones that are weird anomalies that are going to show up in B and A tier that other DPS captains probably wouldn't put in those spots. For specializations, command is still going to be the best one because command is really good for both torpedo stuff and tanking stuff, which is two of the main playstyles for what escorts are actually doing. Temporal is really designed for pure science stuff. The big thing here is, well, there's one particular playstyle with beams that's really good with temporal. We will get to that when we get to that particular ship. Mirror worker is also really good too for energy damage. And again, since this is, you know, escorts, we'll be dealing with energy damage quite a bit for our builds. Pilot, I only really rate here for pilot maneuvers. Otherwise, I think it's pretty much the worst specialization to pick. However, Intel is the weakest here just because, for full specialization, just because it doesn't really get much in terms of what the commander's spot gets over the lieutenant commander Intel. That being said, I would definitely put it over pilot. Then for partial specializations, I still would put temporal over miracle worker because of the flexibility aspect. If you're only considering for PvE, I do think lieutenant commander miracle worker does have some pretty significant advantages as well, and we will get to that in the video as well. Lieutenant command is still like the strongest of all the lieutenant commander stuff, and there actually are like two A tier ships that are just lieutenant commander command seating. All right, as for limitations, again, this is a playstyle only list, so starship traits are not going to be considered for the rankings of these starships. Pets and consoles generally will not as well. However, if pets are exclusive or like restricted to very specific starships or subclasses, and if those pets are inherently strong, then they will be included in this list. Same thing goes for consoles. If consoles are restricted to very specific starships, and if those consoles are strong, then I will consider them for the tier list as well. If pets or consoles don't fall into either of those realms, they will not be considered for this list at all. Cool. All right. As for our playstyle elements, because we are dealing with escorts, and because we're dealing with escorts, a 5-forward weapon layout is going to be the preference for energy damage. Generally speaking, if a starship only has 4 forward weapons as an escort, it's going to go to D tier. The big exception here is going to be if the starship is a torpedo boat or a kinetic boat, if you want to call it. Basically, if the starship has lieutenant commander command or higher seating, 4 forward weapons is actually the preferred weapon layout for torpedoes nowadays. If you're really curious as to why, there are a few posts on STO builds, or you can just ask in like the frequently asked like the weekly dumb questions thread for STO builds, and be like, why is 4 forward weapons better than 5 forward weapons for torpedo damage? And people will be happy to answer your questions. Basically, if a starship cannot have concentrated firepower 3 in their build, and if they only have 4 forward weapons, they're going to immediately be relegated down to D tier. Because of this, there will be a couple of extra starships in D tier than there would be based upon my bell curve. But all in all, it's actually relatively close to what my bell curve actually was for my modified one. So it's not going to matter a ton. But if you go to the very end of the video and look at that TLDR for the escort list, there are going to be a noticeably a little bit more D tier than like B tiers starships. For exotic damage, if you really want to do exotic damage on an escort, you can. If you have 6 science abilities, then I say it's passable. But escorts and cruisers do not get a secondary deflector, so it is going to be extremely limited. I mean, you're ideally probably going to want starships with temporal seating as well to supplement it, because you don't have a secondary deflector to enhance that damage further. Because I am a tank captain, tanking will also be a big consideration for this list. And we'll get to specific ships as to why they're better or worse for tanking when we get to them. I'm a tanking main, so I will be the judge of that and help you out with that. Hangar bays, cloaking, and raider flanking will also be considered. Keep in mind, though, for me, for escorts, raider flanking is kind of a neutral thing, because raiders lose a rear weapon to get that raider flanking. It's not like science vessels and cruisers that like just get raider flanking as something extra on top of the regular base class. So for us here for this video, raider flanking is basically neutral. It's not something that actually makes a ship stronger. It's the flexibility seating that makes a ship a little bit stronger. Cloaking, if it has a battle cloak or better, it'll rank a smidget higher. For hangar bays, again, ideally as many as possible without hurting the class. Dreadnought carriers will get a minor reduction in this list. It's not like science carriers that like you lose your secondary deflector. For dreadnought carriers, it's not that huge of a deal. It's just 1 less weapon. So instead of 8 weapons, you have 7. So it's not as bad. And so there actually are going to be a couple of dreadnought carriers that actually get high marks in this video because they're still serving their purpose. With that being said, for the subclass biases, I still will consider dreadnought carriers the worst, but keep in mind, like an F tier for escorts is not the same as F tier for like science vessels or engineering starships. So we will talk about that in terms of context when we get to like D and F tier, especially in F tier. When we get to that starship, and I tell you where it actually falls in terms of the engineering list. But for the strongest tactical ships, warships, destroyers, and juggernauts by far, warships and destroyers get the best mastery package of all the starships in the game. It is the most offensive mastery package for starships. Juggernauts replace like the most minor of the DPS enhancements of the warships and destroyers to get HP regeneration per 3 seconds added to the starship, which makes the Juggernaut subclass have the best tanking mastery package. So for me, all 3 of those types of starships would fall right into B tier territory. Strike Wing escorts and raiders are basically, here because Strike Wing escorts are basically just escorts with a hangar bay. Raiders are basically just escorts with added flexibility because they lose a weapon, but they gain raider flanking. So for me, that's like basically on par. But raiders get that extra benefit of having really flexible seating. So for me, they are a smidgen above what regular escorts give you. And then dreadnought carriers just flat out lose a weapon to gain a hangar bay. That which doesn't make them stronger, but it doesn't make them super weak versus like what science carriers were last week. Cool. All right, moving on to changes from last year. Just like last time, I did have a carrier reclassification to deal with, which means we do have a Dreadnought carrier added to our list. It's actually a good Dreadnought carrier. I'll talk about why it is when we get to that specific starship. It's good for torpedoes and tanking, which is why it's actually going to rank pretty highly in this list. I also made an oopsie in not one, but 2 Starship Explained videos. And it took me looking through all these ships individually to realize the Fleet Gromba Siege Destroyer is actually an insane starship. So if we actually look at its raw stats, it's actually a Strike Wing Escort that happens to have the Destroyer Mastery package on top of it. Because of that, I moved the Gromba out of the Warship Destroyer list and into the Strike Wing Escorts list. Because of that, if you look at the old versus new, even though we got 6 new warships and destroyers versus last time, that this only increases by 5 because the Fleet Gromba was moved in my personal Excel list from warships and destroyers over to Strike Wing Escorts. We'll talk about why that matters when we get to the list itself. Needless to say, it is a very, very high tier fleet starship for escorts. So this is an old ship for sure, but it is a strong starship. So considering that I overlooked this, I would, if I was a betting person, this is a starship that probably a lot of the community in general is not even thinking about when it comes to performance. So for those of you that are that do torpedo damage, you're probably going to be surprised about where I would put the Fleet Gromba. Please do not sleep on this ship; it is good. All right. As for the new starships, we got 3 new warships: the Mirror Donnie, an Undine warship, and the Mirror Gagarin that we have from just the recent event. We have they added 2 new fleet recon destroyers. Recon destroyers are actually pretty old. They just added the Romulan and Jem'Hadar Vanguard versions of them, so it's kind of like meh there. And then we have another starship from Star Trek Picard that I can't pronounce because nothing from Star Trek Picard I can actually pronounce. We have in terms of escorts, we have the Sister Appalachia, which is actually a pretty good torpedo boat, and then we have the Lockbox Mars, which is just a Mirador but made into an escort. As for the other starships here, we have the Legendary Scimitar added, and then we have another starship from Star Trek Picard because I can't pronounce any of the ships from Star Trek Picard. We have Legendary Tillis, Legendary Burrell, a Raider, the La Sirena from Star Trek Picard, and the Aventimare. Then, of course, the Kirk carry, which was a reclassification from last time. So there actually were 16 new escorts, sort of, in this list. So 15, 16, however you want to count it. So those are the new ships added to this list. And so there's all 117 for ones that I consider escorts in this list. 41 escorts, 11 Strike Wing escorts, 14 warships, 18 destroyers, 8-ish Dreadnought carriers, 6 Juggernauts, and 19 Raiders. Alrighty, going on to the actual raw stats themselves. Because of the huge variance in weapon stuff, like pretty much when it comes down to for the weapons, like escorts get an experimental weapon normally for starships. 2 of the subclasses get rid of that experimental weapon, either just get rid of it or replace it with a weapon. And then Raiders just lose a regular weapon, which is why there's 4 different general weapon layouts possible for the subclasses. It's not that complicated whenever we get to the specific subclasses themselves, but for here it looks a little messy. When you look at the Magic Packers, is actually pretty good. You've got accuracy, which can add to your damage if you have enough accuracy, extra flat weapon damage, and extra flat crit chance. It's just that 5 defense is just the slightly lackluster thing here, but if we were comparing it to science vessels and cruisers, man, this is like better than basically any Master Packers that they will ever get. So escorts are actually really, really good. Just wish that the other subclasses got something as comparatively good. But yeah, and there actually are escort subclasses that are better than this, and we'll talk about them in just a moment. There are big advantages that escorts have, and why I'm having that bias of 5 weapons is generally speaking is because they always have access to dual cannons, and because they're always commander tactical, they always have access to cannon scatter volley 3, besides the 1 cruiser reclassification into this list, which is still a good ship regardless for other reasons. Because of that, it's got the general best damage mastery package of all the classes, and they have really good mobility in general. They generally lack durability, but there are a couple of subclasses that help to remedy that a little bit. In terms of ranges, lower hull and shields, higher mobility overall. Looking at it for the standard Escort subclass, it's actually not a bad option to choose. The reason is because, unlike its Raider version, the standard Escort actually has an advantage over the standard Raider version, and that's if you want to have a mobile starship, but still want to have 8 base weapon slots. Basically, if you want to be mobile but don't want to have to worry about Raider flanking for your damage, standard Escorts are still completely fine to choose. They're still reasonably mobile, and they only have this measured lower hull than most of the average Escorts. Of course, we have, Dreadnought carriers and Juggernauts that help really inflate the number to go way higher, but standard Escorts are still great, and they've got that regular mastery package. Destroyers and warships, on the other hand, they replace that defense, the one that's the only lackluster part of the mastery package, and they get an additional 15% crit severity, which means this is the best mastery package for damage of all the Escorts, and they happen to have reasonably balanced stats as well. Now, it's not as overpoweringly good as some of the other equivalents for the other two classes of starships that are trying to be similar to destroyers and warships, but it's still reasonable for what it's giving you. Basically, it's the same hull and shields on average, but slightly less turning and mobility to have the most offensive mastery package available. It's also why Cryptic is very hesitant to give destroyers and warships primary specializations. For those of you all that are curious about that, most of them do not have primary specializations, and the couple of them that do are mostly pilot, because they're very hesitant to give and make destroyers and warships really, really good, because when they become good, aka the Huznok warship, they stay good forever. So they're very, very hesitant to give destroyers and warships actually good primary specializations. The mastery package helps to carry it and to be better than a lot of the other Escorts just because of that inherent thing. So whenever they have good bridge officer seating, it's just going to rank higher than other Escorts in my list. It's just the way it is. And so yeah, if you're curious though, Juggernauts are pretty much just cruisers with a very offensive mastery package. So I love cruisers a lot. As a tank, they are really, really, really nice. It sucks that the two real Juggernauts are both behind lockbox stuff, but as I've noted in past Starship Explained videos, these scimitars were basically the Juggernaut subclass before the Juggernaut subclass existed, which is why the 4 scimitars in my spreadsheet, 4 of the 6 are actually scimitars, because for me, they're basically the same thing. Even though scimitars don't have the same mastery package as Juggernauts, they still can function the same type of role. So for me, they're just really offensive, highly durable cruisers that actually, happen to pack a punch too. So very, very strong subclass. Beyond them, we have Tactical Raiders. I call them Tactical Raiders just to help clarify things, because sometimes when I say Raider, people think any starship with Raider flanking. So I just always say Tactical Raiders to just help clarify that whenever I'm talking about the Raider subclass, I'm referring to Raiders with that generally have Commander Tactical. There actually are a couple of Raiders with Commander Universal as well. It's also why it took a long time to get frigates. Now frigates have a distinct advantage, and why we don't have any really good frigates right now. We'll get to that in the video next week. But with Raiders, what you got with them is you lose one of your rear weapons. So they either have either a 4-2 plus their experimental, or a 5-1 plus their experimental. And with them, for their mastery package, they're losing their crit chance to get crit severity, which for your high end is still going to be a better trade-off, because at the high end you have so much crit chance, it's just kind of ridiculous. And so for them, crit severity is just a bigger thing. Of course, they would prefer to have the warship destroyer mastery, which puts the crit severity instead of defense, so you still have that crit chance in here. But all in all, for the high-end task graders, still have a good mastery package. They also have really good bridge offer flexibility, so there's definitely that to consider. But yes, they are the least durable escort subclass, and actually, now that I think about it, they are basically the least durable subclass in general. In this video, I will not be specifying whether a starship has raider flanking or improved raider flanking. The general rule for raider flanking is if a starship has a cloak now, it's 33% versus the rear arc, and it's 40% versus the rear arc if they do not have a cloak. And this is a boost. It used to be 25 and 33%. I can't remember if it was whenever the Tamara released, or if it was the Legendary Burrell when that released, whenever Cryptic changed it. But in current Star Trek Online, for raider flanking, normal raider flanking, if you have a cloak, is 33%, and if you're without a cloak, your raider flanking gives you a 40% damage boost. If you're hitting someone at their rear arc, it is significantly lessened if you're in PvP. Just as something to keep in mind. Of course, PvP already has its own issues, so that's why I'm not covering PvP in these lists at all. Very, very mobile subclass, and it's still reasonable for what it's giving you in terms of damage. For Strikewing Escorts, on the other hand, what you're losing here is the mobility to get the hangar bay, and that's what it comes down to. For the longest time, we didn't have any primary specialization Strikewing Escorts in the game. We did get a starship from Star Trek Picard that did change that, which happens to be a really, really good escort. Not just because of its mastery package, but because of its unique pets, which we'll talk about. I will briefly talk about it, but yeah. The one new Strikewing Escort that we got from that is a really, really good Strikewing Escort, and it's like top tier, A tier for the starships in this list. And of course, last and sort of least is the Dreadnought Carriers. Again, they are very durable. They're escorts with 2 hangar bays, but they're pretty much just Strikewing Escorts that exchange that experimental weapon for an additional hangar bay. Now, for the average player, for a lot of your average players that don't know how to build starships, this is actually going to be a DPS increase, because a lot of beginning players don't know what the best experimental weapons are, which is totally reasonable. It's another one of those mechanics that Cryptic doesn't really explain. But with that being said, it's still a two hangar bay starship that is losing something from the starship to get that second hangar bay, which still sucks. However, if you're going to do torpedo stuff, or if you want to tank on these are still reasonable starships. There are better options for sure, but these are still reasonable starships nonetheless. And so yeah, moving on from there, per normal, I am trying to do a bell curve for this video. With our 1 S tier starship as the Jack of all trades escort, our F tier starship as the worst escort, not the worst like starship in general, but just the worst escort for this video. And then of course trying to do the bell curve of 10%, 20% of starships, 40%, 20%, 10%. As noted earlier, because D tier and below are going to be starships that only have 4 forward weapons and cannot slot concentrate firepower 3 in their build, there is going to be a couple of extra ships in D and E tier than what there technically should be for this bell curve that I'm describing here. So it'd probably be more like 10%, 20%, 35%, 25%, like 10%, and then the last starship. So it's not much of a change, but it is going to be there. If you're wanting to pick like escorts based upon not just what their performance is, but what you get out of them too, feel free to see the best slot box and promo starships, best Libosaur starships video, and the best Cuba token starships video as well. And again, if you're a beginner to Star Trek Online and want to know what like some budget stuff is, the Budget Builds 2020 edition video is going to be a great spot for you. For weapon-based builds, it is still current. There are some things to add to it for science stuff, which I did note in the last video. So if you're curious about that, just go back to this point in the last video. Just like wait like a minute or two, and I will mention what console you need to add. Again, just like last video, this is kind of like a sequel, 3 or 4 video series to the Starship classes explain videos and the best tanks in Star Trek Online video. Just talk about all the ships instead of just tanks. So with that said, let's get into the tier list. As for the tier list itself, we'll be starting with S tier. And unlike science vessels, there were actually a lot of starships to choose that I could have put into S tier. So just because I'm going to have one particular ship here doesn't mean that there aren't other options that could have also gone here. As a reminder, for S tier, it has to be a starship that can slot concentrate free firepower 3 because it needs to be able to do raw engine damage and torpedo damage and tank, which means my general go-to starship that I've mentioned a long time in my starship comparisons videos did not qualify for this S tier starship. So I had to start looking around like, all right, based upon the rules that I have set, what starships can fit here? And so I basically got a list of like 6 different starships that were all strong starships that are from the A and B tiers. And I'm like, okay, with these starships, let's start going down. And I started like the process of elimination. There was one starship that basically had to take the cake, and it's because of actually what my cruiser list is, and it had to be the legendary Scimitar. I did bash this ship a bit in the starship comparisons video, and it was because I didn't really like the thing that this ship adds is that it's basically all 3 old Scimitars into one starship. That's really the big thing that this starship gets. And for that high flexibility, alongside the console set and hangar pets that it can offer, in my opinion, it really is the best jack of all trades escort. It's not the best escort, but it is the best jack of all trades. So that's why it's going to be here in S tier. And why is it S tier? It is a 5.3 commander tactical version of the Styx Terran Dreadnought Cruiser, which might be a slight spoiler as to where the Styx is going to show up in the next video. But regardless, here's all the fun things that this ship can do. It is workable for torpedoes because it has a Lieutenant Commander command. Also, for spoilers for the rest of this video, torpedo builds don't really like engineering seating too much. And so they're like, if we have to have high engineering seating, we prefer to have something like command or something else on that seat. And that's exactly what this improvement of the Scimitar gives you. Lieutenant Commander Engineering Command means you can replace the annoying engineering abilities with command abilities alongside Concentrate Firepower 3, of course. You have 3 universal seats for high flexibility. Commander Tactical, because that's still really nice. 5.3 weapon layout for scatter volley builds is still great. High base durability for tanking. But really more importantly, especially from a tanking perspective, we have the flagship set available to this ship, which is awesome. And we have 2 unique hangar pets. We have Romulan drone ships available to this ship, normally only available to, well, I'll put it this way. Romulan drone ships are unlocked with the Scimitar, and they're equipable on the Scimitar, and then the Romulan warbird carriers. So that's like 3 ships in total that can use Romulan drone ships. Alongside Romulan drone ships, the Scimitars are allowed to use Malum support frigates, which are starships, or which are frigates that are normally only available to flight deck carriers and dreadnought carriers and regular science carriers. But Scimitars are allowed to also get this ship. And here's the thing. Everyone likes to tout the Terran Empire frigates because they have Suppression Barrage 3 and Attack Pattern Beta 3. But guess what? The Malum support frigate serves a very similar role. They also have Suppression Barrage 3 and they have Sensor Scan 1. Which, yes, is not quite as strong as Attack Pattern Beta 3, so the 6 is still better in this regard. But you know what? They still have a damage resistance debuff. It's not as good and it's not as spammable. But you know what? The Malum support frigate is honestly the closest thing we have in comparison to the Terran Empire frigates today. And in my opinion, this is part of the reason why the support carriers were added to the game at all. Feel free to see my support carrier video if you want me to go more in depth into that. But basically what it comes down to is that these Scimitars happen to have a frigate pet normally stuck on 2 hangar carriers, which means it's a single hangar starship that happens to have a pet that normally is just for tanking. That's very comparable to what the Styx is able to do. It's, is a commander tactical starship, so it has some unique fun things with it. It can do scatter volley stuff. If you wanted to be like the Styx, you can do broadsiding with this thing too. There's nothing wrong with that by any stretch of the imagination. And you've got fun battle cloaking stuff with this thing too, alongside the flagship set. For me, the flagship set kind of is what kind of sets it apart as well, because sure, you're downgraded from the 6's commander command to lieutenant commander command on this thing, but you've got the flagship set in Constellation to help you out a little bit too. So for me, they're very, very close in power, and this thing's also an escort too, which does help. So for me, this ship just really has to be here in the list. Again, if you're going for straight damage, there are better options. If you're going for the record-breaking ISC stuff, maybe you're not going to use the Romulan drone ship, because that has torpedoes. But then again, both the main support frigate and the Terran Empire frigates both have torpedoes. So if DPS community was really being serious about about trying to make sure that pets don't have torpedoes on them, then both of these pets would be banned, and you'd be wanting to slot in something else that just had all energy weapons. So there is, it depends on how picky you really want to get for your IC run in terms of what your group wants to ban, to try to get your one player that's going to be trying to get in that 2 million plus DPS IC run, in terms of what things they're going to ban, what things that they're going to say is allowed. The Legendary Scimitar is a fantastic ship. Maybe I've said that too much, but yeah. And also, whenever you consider, this is a legendary starship. It's not a low buy lockbox promo ship. It's a legendary starship, which means it is a bit more expensive. You pay for it once, and it is account unlocked. And so I think that definitely helps as well for those of you out there looking at these lists. In terms of the S tier starships, this is the only one that's not in a lockbox or promo box. So that should definitely help you all as well. Moving on from S tier, we get to A tier, stuff that I consider honestly pretty top tier. Now, there are some ships that are going to be in A tier, which might be a little bit questionable for the DPS community. So just keep that as a warning. It's because they basically break the rules in some way that most other escorts really can't do. So that being said, we're going to start with the Valor Juggernaut. It is still the ISA Direction Energy Weapon King by far. It also has really high durability, which means it's really good for tanking. That being said, it is a little bit trickier to tank with. Miracle Worker Intel on its 2 tactical states means you don't really get much in terms of survival from those, generally speaking. There is a Commander Miracle Worker ability that you sacrifice your weapon, your shields for some extra hull and hull regen, which is what I would recommend to use for this particular ship, because you have enough hull that actually makes a difference, which can allow her to still tank. It is definitely trickier and a little bit more unconventional to do so versus other tanks, and so there is going to be another Juggernaut tank that's going to be in A tier that we'll talk about a little bit later. Still really strong for direction energy weapon stuff. However, its lack of mobility does hurt it a little bit, alongside some other things into consideration. The Star Trek Picard Strikewing Warbird that was added is its common replacement for a lot of IC runs, actually. Thanks to the unique weapons that was released with this Strikewing Warbird, combined with it because of its stacking mechanic for extra damage, and that its unique hanger pets can also stack that specific energy type. If you synergize with those specific hanger pets, this ship can actually out DPS the Valor Juggernaut in ISC. So with those fun mechanics in mind, that kind of just has to be here, alongside the fact that it's got command intel seating, which is still good for torpedo builds. That being said, that Lieutenant Commander Engineering seats like an eyesore for torpedo stuff. You have to deal with like 2 dead abilities, but it's not the end of the world, and you don't have like any dead science abilities on this thing either. Which, well, actually now that I'm saying that, Photonic Copter is what you prefer to have for torpedo builds, so you don't have to deal with draining ox power because of the one console from the C-Store Grissom. So yeah, I probably spoke a little bit too soon for there. Still a great starship. It's got battle cloak. It's got a hangar bay. It's the only full spec strike wing escort in the game. Great ship. it's still a passable torpedo boat, and it's really, really great for ISC scatter volley builds too. So with that all said, it needs to be there. So yeah, with that all said, let's move on. After that, we have the Lobai Mach-E Raider. For me, this probably should be, I mean, maybe this should be slightly lower on the list, but for me, it's basically just a flexible, more affordable Valbar Juggernaut that doesn't have the theoretical damage potential of Valbar Juggernaut, but it's more flexible, and it's just more affordable. So it just needs to be here. And instead of raw durability, it's got mobility to add to it. And sure, it loses a weapon, but you still have Raider flanking, and it's that 40% Raider flanking because it doesn't have a cloak. So because a lot of people don't bother with cloaks in most runs, you know what? That's still a smidgen of an improvement. Again, low durability is what holds the ship back, combined with no secondary specialization on the ship itself. Still, we don't have a ton of commander tactical American worker starships in the game, so this ship deserves its A tier spot. Alongside that ship is the Huznok warship, which again, as I alluded to earlier in this video, is the tried and true beam overload plus recursive shearing build in the game. It is starting to show its age. We're starting to get other starships that are getting close to its power. Cryptic has been really, really hesitant to release at least a ship better than this ship for some reason. I don't understand why. And it wouldn't be that hard. Like I'm not even kidding by this. You could easily just add a commander tactical temporal, like warship that just happens to have Lieutenant Commander Miracle Worker, and it would be objectively better than this ship. It's not that difficult to make a better ship. I gave you one idea, Cryptic. Please go and make it. This ship is old. It would be nice to have a ship that's better than this in the game. It's still good. It still is, you know, a good direct and edgeable weapon DPS platform. It is a warship, which again, as I've noted earlier in this video, that means it's got the best DPS mastery package with the rest of its seating. It would just be nice if we got a new warship that was actually better than this one. So, you know, as maybe Cryptic will one day do it. Maybe Huznok warships still keep on selling so well that the Cryptic just doesn't bother. Because maybe according to their economists and financial analysts on staff, they might say, oh, well, if we make a better Huznok warship, we'll lose more money. I don't know. I don't think it would make too much of a difference. If they could just make it a lockbox or a promo ship and you do temporal plus Miracle Worker, and I think it would sell, and this ship would still sell as a slightly budget alternative. That's just me ranting and smacking my mouth around. But this is still a good ship. Its high durability means it's decent for tanking, if you're curious about that. But it's really here because of its damage potential. After that is going to be the Liberated Borg Juggernaut. This is here because this is the Juggernaut that's just much easier to tank on. It does have low turning, but it's got really high inertia. And it's got reasonable hull and high shields too. So you're able to rely on both the hull and the shields to help you with tanking. You can do torpedo stuff with this thing as well, but again, Lieutenant Commander Engineering is not ideal for torpedo boats. So that is a bit of a downside for the ship. If you're going to do torpedo stuff, you do have to keep that in mind, or just not use the Seastar Grissom's console, frankly. Or just understand it's not going to go for very long because of Oxtabat needed for the build itself. So I really love the ship. There's really not too much wrong with it. It's also a slightly more affordable Juggernaut. Like if you're picking a Juggernaut just to tank on, the Liberated Borg Juggernaut is just a much more affordable option, frankly, to pick. Then again, the Juggernaut's been around for so long that its price, I think, has gone down a smidget to the point that you do see it on the exchange from time to time. Needless to say, they're still both Juggernauts. You know, you basically are just losing a smidget of actually to get HP regen per 3 seconds, so it's still going to be a reasonable DPS platform too. It's just not going to be as oppressive as some of the other platforms here. So for me, it's really the torpedo and tanking platform. But obviously, if you want to do scatter volley, I mean, it's still another option you could do as well, because you have no forced science seating. You can just do a full Oxbat build with Lieutenant Commander Engineering and Incident Engineering. Then you've got a bunch of extra. You can use a full Lieutenant Commander Universal seat for more tactical abilities if you wish, and just use a couple of the other specialist tactical abilities for those specialist abilities. Still a great ship, but its strength is in torpedo and tank and stuff. After that, we get to the Zenkethi Zentar. For this ship in particular, this is when this ship released, it was known as the OP torpedo platform. It is still a good platform, mind you. It is still a really good platform. Its seating is great. What holds it back nowadays is the weapon layout. Because of its subclass combined with its weapon layout, it's not quite as ideal as other torpedo boats nowadays. The ideal platform would be 5.3 or more preferably a 4.4. Only having four weapons for your 4 preferable torpedoes in the game, combined with 4 rear weapons to get as many mines as possible. Spamming it in ISC is the way to go right now. That being said, considering the platform that the Zenkethi Zentar is on, it is still a good ship. Its bridge officer does not hold it back at all. It's just the weapon layout and the platform itself is what's holding it back a little bit. Which is why there are other ships that can do better torpedo stuff than this ship in current Star Trek Online. Still a good ship. And hey, if you have tons of low buy and are looking for a torpedo boat, this is not a bad option to choose. There's just stronger options nowadays. After that, we start getting into starships that start breaking what's normally allowed for Star Trek Online, and we're going to go with the La Sirena to start off with. This is a starship with double commander seating, and that second commander seat is not a forced, a forced like specific for that for its seating. So you've got really high flexibility alongside its regular flexibility for being a raider. So it's definitely nice there. Pilot plus intel for its seating. Pilot doesn't matter too much, but hey, Lieutenant Intel is definitely doesn't hurt the ship by any means. Still, it's a very mobile ship with a little bit low durability. I personally prefer the Mirror Donnie myself. Then again, that's because it's Commander Tactical plus Commander Engineering. Again, I'm a tank captain. I like to see this, and you know what? It's got reasonable durability alongside what that it's actually doing. I rank it smidget lower because there's no primary spec, and its second commander seat is forced. Is why I rank it below the La Sirena. But they are both comparable. And it's a durable platform, which means if you want to tank on this thing, you definitely can. It's definitely meant to more be a direct energy weapon based starship for sure. More of its design is that you can just do you can just have all the Oxbat and stuff on the one seat, so that you can have 4 tactical bridge officers on this if you want, which does help a little bit for Federation captains that do not have access to having all their seats SROs for their bridge officers. And that you can actually have 4 SROs instead of only going down to like 3 or 2 for a lot of like your better cruisers, for instance. Again, and you add to that you do have the best mastery package available because of it is a warship, and it is a great platform. Alongside them, we have the Kelvin heavy destroyers. The only difference between these guys is that the D7's got a battle cloak, and the regular Kelvin or Einstein class, whichever one you want to call the ship, doesn't have that battle cloak. Exact same stats otherwise. I rank it a little bit lower just because it's just one commander universal, and there's no other command seat. And also my experimentation for tanking, because I do have to have both of these ships, thanks to mods market stuff. In my experimentation, it's just better to go Commander Tactical. Even from a tanking standpoint, it's just better to go Commander Tactical. It is ranked this high because with Commander Universal plus its Ensign Universal, you can have 6 science abilities on this starship, and you have Gravity Well 3 as a thing. So if you really want to do that, you can do it on this ship. Plus its strong base subclass match package alongside the other things that this ship is doing. It technically really should be a solid B tier starship, but because of the rules that I set out in this video, it sneaks right into A tier, but it is towards the bottom. And again, and these next two starships are kind of interchangeable and like right at the bottom of A tier. And these two ships, the Legendary Talus and the Event Temare, are our stealth bombers of Star Trek Online. They both have an enhanced battle cloak and Lieutenant Commander Command for Concentrated Firepower 3 shenanigans while you're in your enhanced battle cloak. Enhanced battle cloaks are able to fire torpedoes while cloaked, which gives them a smidgen of an advantage, but not all ships with enhanced battle cloaks get Lieutenant Commander Command, so not all starships with enhanced battle cloaks can actually capitalize on being able to fire torpedoes while cloaked as effectively as these ships can. For me personally, I personally love the Legendary Talus. I do understand from the DPS community that the Event Temare is actually the better ship, but this is one of those situations where I'm just going to say, you know what, this is my tier list. And for me, I cannot see the Temare above the Legendary Talus, and the Temare has to be an A tier starship. So by default, I have to put the Legendary Temare or the Legendary Talus up before the Temare. So the Legendary Talus gets to be an A tier starship as well. Both solid ships. So I personally prefer the Legendary Talus. You do actually get a primary specialization with this thing, and you can do science stuff a lot easier with this thing because you got Commander intelligence. But you know, for realistic DPS players, the Temare is just going to be the better starship to pick. Also, it's slightly more maneuverable too. With that said, we're closing out of A tier, and now we're going on to B tier stuff. So with these ships, again, these are starships that I feel have a noticeable drop in performance, or just don't have the game-breaking stuff that some of the ships in A tier are just allowed to have. Starting off B tier, it's going to be the Promo Herc Dreadnought Carrier. This is our starship reclassification starship that used to be in the cruiser list, and now it is in the escort list. Thematically, to me, it makes the most sense to put here in escorts and to put here at the top of B tier because, well, Dreadnought carriers, generally speaking, do have a distinct disadvantage versus other subclasses. However, this is a Commander Command starship, which means this is still a very solid torp boat and a very solid tanking boat. And with 4-3 layout, it does make it a slightly better platform for tanking. That being said, you know, as a Commander Command starship, you still can do Concentrated Firepower 3 plus. Is it called Emergency Artillery 3 for what the command? I think it's whatever one that one is. I don't do torpedoes too much. But there is a strong Commander Command ability plus the clicky itself for Commander Command, which is really nice. But what it comes down to is that it's a solid torpedo boat because your only forced high engineering seat is Engineering Command. And as a tanking platform, I mean, realistically, by the way, in modern Star Trek Online, because of the command specialization buffs, honestly, Suppression Barrage 3 is better than Reverse Shield Polarity 3. So this is a starship that even if it was like Commander Tactical, a Lieutenant Commander Engineering, it would actually perform the exact same for a tanking perspective, frankly. Also, and I will mention this here, even though this ship has 7 weapons, as I've alluded to in other videos, in the math, if you're doing just a full energy weapon build, the difference between 7 beams and 8 beams is generally speaking going to be the exact same DPS, which is why generally for beam builds that are actually going for damage, you will have 7 beams and 1 torpedo. One thing to consider though for tanking is that, you know, you're generally going to be tanking in a run like ISC, where you're probably going to have one player who is the torpedo boat, and they don't want anyone else to be firing torpedoes. And so in that scenario, you're not going to have your dark matter torpedo. You're just going to have 8 weapons instead to try to boost that torpedo DPS captain as much as possible. With that all said, so for you, that's another situation where you would have 7 energy weapons versus 8. And so the downside of having 1 less weapon doesn't actually affect you quite as much as it normally would. That being said, having 7 versus 8 weapons firing does mean that even though you have theoretically the same DPS, you will have less threat because you have more shots being fired continuously. It's just the way that it works. So you will have same damage but slightly less threat, which means that for these ships you need to have slightly more damage. Which, guess what? In the subclass itself, you get some additional damage, which is not there in at least many of the cruiser subclasses. So the Dreadnought carrier does have its Dreadnought carriers have their inherent weaknesses for sure. But for tanking, there's stuff that can be mitigated, and this ship does that the best, honestly, for tanking, and it's still a solid torpedo platform too. So for me, with all that stuff considered and how high-end stuff works nowadays, this gets to be the top tier B tier spot. Are there better ships for tanking? Yes. Are there better ships for torpedo damage? Yes. But look, it's still a solid ship for both those things, and it's got really high hull to support the current meta of just high hull and just do flat out hull tanking. This is also the starship that if you're trying to pick it to try to get as much max HP as possible, this is the ship to pick. I haven't kept up with the HP chasers for a while to know if people have actually broken 1 million max HP yet. I mean, I know people have broken like 2 million if you're considering like max HP plus temporary HP, but I don't know if people have broken just normal 1 million max HP. If you happen to have broken that 1 million barrier for maximum HP, I would love to see a screenshot. So, however, links are generally, well, yeah. So yeah, just feel free to let me know, like in my email or something, if you happen to have that. I would love to see some screenshots and be able to share them on the channel, or just share the screenshot on Reddit. I'm sure people would be fine to upvote that too. So, anyway, with that said, let's move on. After them is the Lockbox Pilot Destroyer, another starship that I just Deimos, however you say that ship. This is one of the weird ones in this list. This is actually a starship that I kind of placed last, or it was definitely one of the last starship ships that I placed in the rankings. It's a starship that I feel is stronger than a lot of the ships after it, but I didn't feel that it had any noticeable strength above the ships above it. So that this is kind of like one of those ones that I don't have a ton of opinions on. It's just a very solid ship. If we're doing standard direct and weapon-based meta, I mean, what do you have for this ship? You have Lieutenant Commander Tactical plus, Commander Tactical plus Lieutenant Commander Tactical. You have a specialization to add to that, so you can have an extra tactical ability. You have weapons and merge-powered weapons, merge-powered engines, and you can do a half-bat build with Ox to Bat 1 and Photonic Officer 1. Honestly, it's a reasonably solid ship, frankly. It's not a big standout, but it's very solid, very maneuverable, reasonable durability as well, and it has the best DPS master package. So again, it's one of those starships that's like, it's not this huge standout like, oh, this is an awesome ship, but it's like, yeah, it's a high good ship, but in many ways it's kind of just this run-of-the-mill starship. After that one is where we get to the original tier 6 flagships scimitars. Here is the seating for all three of them. What you're going to notice that versus the legendary scimitar, you have slightly more limited in your bridge officer seating, and your lieutenant commander command seat is always a universal seat, which is a downside for torpedo builds, because as you might recall from the earlier discussion on the legendary scimitar, what was nice about the about that platform for torpedoes was that the high lieutenant commander and engineering seat was its command seat as well. For this starship, if you're going to do pure torp, like if you're going to do DPS or whatever, that's not tanking, you're probably going to pick the Kopesh, because at least you only have a lieutenant engineering seat and 5 base tactical consoles. But of course, if you're going to tank, then this ship doesn't really face much of the differences for the Legendary Scimitar personally. You have lower stats for sure, and slightly lower maneuverability, but a lot of those other things for tanking still remains the same. It's really just the knock for torpedoes is what holds these ships a little bit farther down the list. But you can still do most of those other things that I was mentioning in terms of a 5.3 commander tactical version of the sticks as well. So you still have the flagship set, you still have the unique hangar pets. It's still a good energy platform, and it's just a slightly worse torpedo platform combined with the lower stats, which puts it into D tier for me. Like, honestly, if I was putting the Legendary Scimitar in this list without the C tier, it would have been the top A tier. Sorry, it would have been the top B tier starship actually. So like the Legendary Scimitar and honestly in real reference, if we didn't have S tier and F tier, it would not have been that much higher than these ships, but just enough combined with all the other flexibility, which made me have to put that one as the S tier pick. So if you're worried about like, hey, CounterYolo was saying like that the Legendary Scimitar is like this super good ship. These ships perform very similarly. So like if you're thinking about hey, do I really want to get the Legendary Scimitar? Like, don't worry too much about it. I mean, like obviously if you want all the customizations of the Scimitar, then sure, go ahead and get the Legendary Scimitar or Legendary Dreadnought Warper bundle. Legendary Warper, whatever one that the Legendary Scimitar is in, that also has the horrible Dideridex in it. Just because that's cheaper than getting the tier 6 Scimitar bundle and the tier 5 Scimitar bundle for all those looks. And also because, I mean, unlike the Legendary Scimitar, you basically have to choose between two different starships. Like if you want to do damage, you pick the Kopesh, and if you want to do tanking, you pick the Shamshir. With Legendary Scimitar, you have one ship and you can do both those playstyles at the same time in the single ship. Cool. Alrighty. Moving on, we get to the Fleet Nazi Ground Siege Destroyer. As I noted earlier in this video, this ship is good. We are in high B tier territory for a really old fleet starship. Why is this ship here? Well, I mean, first off, this is a starship that I classified wrong and was looking at the wrong way, because in the olden days, this was a good this is a good energy based starship because of siege mode. Plus, it also had a hangar bay. If you look even in the Star Trek online wiki, it is classified as a destroyer, which makes sense. Except if you look at the mobility of this starship and its base stats compared to what you typically see for Strike Wing Escorts, it's basically the same. And so what we actually end up having here is a Strike Wing Escort that happens to have a better mastery package. Like this is an insane starship, which for me makes this the best commander tactical torpedo platform from the fleet. Objectively, this is the best one. Yes, it's old, it's ugly. Everyone, including me, overlooked this starship. I mean, I've talked about the like the fleet Subclass Silk for a long time, and I've been ignoring this torpedo boat. Like, it took me to making this video, well, the list of like my big spreadsheets, to realize how strong this stupid starship is. Now, I don't know if this ship would actually, because I'm not in the torpedo meta, I don't know if this ship would beat the Fleet Malachowski, because the Fleet Malachowski is commander engineering / command. So I don't know if the good master package plus 2 tactical consoles over the Fleet Malachowski beats having call emergency artillery 3. I don't know. You would have to talk to your torpedo friends that do DPS chasing to be able to tell you if this starship or the Fleet Malachowski would win in a DPS battle for ISE and stuff. But because I've overlooked this, I am guessing that a lot of the high-end DPS players probably are overlooking this starship as well. So if you're a DPS chaser, please check out this starship. Yes, it's not as good as some of the other torpedo platforms already on this list, But this is your best option from the fleet, at least on the escort side of things. Which, you know what? Now I'm thinking about it, you know, this is a battle between a Klingon starship and a Federation starship, which I guess is very fitting. I wish we had more of that in Star Trek Online instead of just a Klingon starship being just a flat-out clone of the Federation version. For those that are actually curious, this is actually the Klingon version of the Galaxy X, which is a cruiser, but they made it an escort and just made it way better. So it has to be here. This is a great ship. Yes, it's ugly because it's old, and because it's a Nausicaan starship, there's like no chance of ever getting a legendary version of this, or like I really doubt we'll ever get another Nausicaan ship that's basically this ship but better. I really doubt we'll ever get something like that, because if they ever made a new Nausicaan ship that was like this, they would probably say, no, we're not going to give this allow ship to be a strike wing escort with the destroyer mastery package. Cryptic probably won't ever let that happen again. So, but because of how Star Trek Online was old and broke a lot of its rules in the early days, that rules that we have now, or at least the starships generally follow now, this is a starship that gets to be a super strong starship. So yeah, I guess to be here in this list. But right behind the Nausicaan Garamba is the Fleet Veteran Destroyers, which, generally speaking, if we're going to be honest here, are just prettier, more expensive, more exclusive, inferior versions of the Fleet Garamba. And this is still a very strong, good command tactical torpedo platform. But if you're actually looking at what the Fleet Garamba has, it's basically just these ships, plus you have an extra hangar bay, which, yes, is similar in power to the Gemini Vanguard's Wingman Mechanic. But keep in mind, the Wingman Mechanic isn't going to keep on getting buffed and buffed and buffed over time, while the Fleet Garamba has a hangar bay. And guess what? Cryptic will in the future keep on releasing better and better and better hangar pets that the Garamba can keep on using. And we do have lots of great squadron pets right now in the game. So I do view the Fleet Garamba better than the veteran Gemini Vanguard Heavy Destroyer. Yes, the Gemini Vanguard Heavy Destroyer looks amazing. And so does the Chimera / Manticore. Those two ships look amazing to me. But if we're actually looking at the numbers, looking at what the ships can offer, they're just inferior, more expensive, prettier versions of the Fleet Garamba. So, and I would imagine the veteran ships are probably talked about a lot, and the Garamba is on a similar power level, but they have a hangar bay additionally, which makes them better. So that's just my 2 cents on that. The Garamba and the veteran destroyers are both good platforms. Cool. Alrighty. Moving on, we have the Promo to List Temporal Warbird here. So this is a very strong balanced starship. This is one of my go-tos when I talk about Jack of all trades starships. It can do just about everything in the game. What does hurt it, obviously, is that there is no Lieutenant Commander command seat to synergize with the Enhanced Battle Cloak, which does hurt it. If it had Lieutenant Commander command instead of Lieutenant Commander pilot, it would have been our S-tier starship for today. But because it doesn't, it has to be here. As basically just slightly better versions of what the Fleet Temporal warships are. So what it comes down to is that this is a very mobile and reasonably durable starship for its mobility with a cloak. So to put it in comparison, in many ways, this is just a more expensive, slightly inferior version of the Huznuk warship. Still great starship. Nothing particularly insanely wrong with her. But it's because a lot of people will just pick a starship for just one particular playstyle, is why this thing isn't going to be as strong as it is for many other players. Still flexible and still good nonetheless. After her, obviously, is going to be our Fleet Temporal warships, which in many ways is basically just the Huznuk warship, but a little bit weaker and available from your fleet. So they're still great platforms. Again, the Temporal Warbird here is basically just a budget promo to list. The other ones are basically meant to kind of more like the budget the Huznuk warship. If you actually look at its base hull, its base hull is actually similar to the Tillis actually. So another thing to think about. generally speaking, if you're going for damage, you will pick the German Vanguard warship because it also has the wingman mechanic. Yes, both the Klingon and Romulan version do have their own versions of battle cloaks. The Romulan one has the better battle cloak because of the Romulan battle cloak extra damage stuff over the Klingon version, but still good regardless. The Klingon one is like last time in the last video, the Klingon one is generally the one that you pick if you're going for durability. And then if the German Vanguard one is available, that's the one that is the generally good damage one. That also happens to be the flimsiest of the four. Still a great starship. Still a great group of starships anyway. And yeah, even though the Hudson warship is the top tier for Commander Temporal for recursive shearing and beam overload, these ships are very serviceable replacements. They just don't have the durability that the Hudson has, so it has to go down here. Their DPS potential is similar though, and I do need to mention that their DPS potential is very similar. So those of you that are curious about that, yes, these ships are still good. That being said, right after them is the Legendary Defiant. Basically just a slightly more durable pilot version of the Fleet Temporal warships. Pilot doesn't add a ton to starships. It's really just pilot maneuvers, which means, yes, DPS captains are going to probably tell me, why is Legendary Defiant here? It should have been like C tier or something. It's a durable warship alongside pilot maneuvers. So I am putting it here. Like if I was going to tank on a starship with pilot maneuvers, this is my number one pick. My number two pick is all the way down in D tier, but we'll talk about why it is later. But very solid ship, and this is a significant, and I mean it by a very, very significant upgrade over the Fleet Defiant. So, and you'll see how low the Fleet Defiant is much later in the video. Still, there is no strong specialization on the ship, but Commander Pilot does make the ship fun to fly too. So I think it's a good ship. But of course, if you're not dealing with tanking stuff, then there are many better options for you to pick for sure. Right after the Defiant is the Kelvin D4X. This is the fastest raider in the game, and by and large the best bird of prey in the game. One thing you do need to keep in mind is that every bird of prey in the game, it has full universal seating. Something that Cryptic has done for a long time is that if a starship has completely universal seating and not just all but the commander seat, if it has full universal seating, they lower its total bridge offshore abilities by 1. So unlike other tier 6 starships that have 13 bridge offshore abilities, this ship only has 12. Fortunately, this ship still has 5 bridge offshore seats, but your seats here is a commander seat, a lieutenant commander seat, 2 lieutenant seats, and an ensign seat. So that is something you need to keep in mind. Bird of Preys have 1 less total bridge offshore ability, which does hurt them a little bit, especially in these rankings. But still, it's got raider flanking, it's got a battle cloak, it's got pilot maneuvers, and it's got 5 forward weapons. It's hard to go wrong with this ship, especially because you can do whatever you want really with the ship in terms of energy-based damage. I wish the Legendary Borel got the same treatment as this ship, but then I guess people wouldn't buy the D4X, which I guess was the reason why that ship never got 4 forward weapons. But the Kelvin D4X is still a fantastic starship. A lot of people will probably bash it a little because it's just Commander Pilot with Lieutenant Temporal. So in terms of the DPS potential, it's not quite as high as some other ships, but I think it's the best bird of prey, and so I think it deserves its spot here. Right after that one is the original Sea Star Gemini Vanguard warship. This is another run-of-the-mill starship that there's no primary specialization, but Lieutenant Commander Miracle Worker is still solid. It's got solid stats, 5-3 weapon layout, best DPS master package available, and it's got the wing mechanic. So when it comes to a solid starship without any gimmicks and no primary specialization, and doing for a direct energy weapon based build, this is about as good as you're going to get inside the game. You'll use that lieutenant seat there for more engineering stuff, and you've got a very solid bridge offshore seating regardless outside of that. Yes, there are like the Fleet Miracle Worker battle cruisers will out DPS this thing, but from the escort standpoint, there's still nothing wrong with this ship. Alongside that ship is one of the newest ships in the game, the Sea Star Appalachia. This is another ship that's meant to be a torpedo boat that's got Lieutenant Commander Command and Lieutenant Intel, which is a decent combination. What holds the ship back is that Lieutenant Commander Engineering C, which again, in the current torpedo meta, having high engineering seating that doesn't have a specialization on it does hurt the starship. That being said, as long as you work around that or just don't use the Grissom console, this is a very solid torpedo boat regardless to use. So if you're curious about my rankings of that new ship, which I didn't do a starship comparison video for, this is where I would generally put that ship. And right after that is the Mir Gagarin warship, which for me is just the Appalachia with a slightly better mastery package, but a slightly worse bridge officer seating because it doesn't have that intelligence seat. For those of you that are wondering, this is the torpedo version of the Fleet Gagarin or the Fleet Shepherd. Again, it has the same issues as the Appalachia in that it has Lieutenant Commander Engineering seating, which does hurt the starship. But I do think Lieutenant Intel is better than the additional, or sorry, is a little worse than the additional slight extra damage increase that you get from the mastery package. So I'm putting the Mir Gagarin here. Cool. All right, the Gagarin is this Mir Gagarin is still a good ship. Okay, for those of you that earn this ship, this is a very, very good ship to have. All right, right after them is going to be our fleet. Discovery Era Strike Wing Escorts. These are starships that have a 5-4 weapon layout with Lieutenant Commander Command, which means it's slightly less optimal for torpedo builds, but you can do scatter volley on these things still as well. Nothing is totally wrong with them. The Klingon version is the clearly better one from a stat standpoint, but the fleet angle actually has alternative looks. While the Klingon version, like with just about all Discovery Klingon starships, does not have an alternative version for current Star Trek Online. Star Trek Online did do a lore blog basically explaining why they were going to do modern visuals for the Discovery Federation starships, but not for the Discovery Klingon. I think it was kind of silly, but you know what, Cryptic? Hey, if you feel that you don't want to give us unique looks for the KDF, so be it. I just wish it was equally the same way for the Federation ships too. Anyway, for these starships, still solid B tier starships. If you want to do scatter volley stuff with this ship, you definitely can. If you want to do torpedo stuff, you can as well. What hurts, like this is a very well-rounded platform with decent stats. We do have better starships in this list already, though, that can do either of those things. And I don't think it's at the flexible enough level, frankly, for what it's given you to rank higher than those of other ships in this list already. It's still solid. These are still solid ships, and some of the better options from the fleet if you want to use scatter volley stuff without as much offensive stuff from them. I still think the Mir battle cruisers are better if you're going to do scatter volley stuff, but on the tactical side of things, they're okay. Not great, but they're okay starships. And to round out B tier, we're going to have a lockbox strike wing escort, which is basically just the 4-3 variant of the fleet ships. Because I consider this ship basically on par with these ones, but these ships are way cheaper for the average player than a lockbox starship. I put the lockbox starship lower. Also, it's an older ship, so it's not going to have as updated of looks for its materials and stuff. Yeah, still a solid ship. Still has some of the engineering issues. Same thing with Lieutenant Engineering as that one. Not as bad as the Lieutenant Commander, obviously, but it's still something you do need to keep in mind. Cool. Okie dokie. With that all said, let's move on into C tier. So yeah, for C tier, as a reminder, what C tier is going to be is basically all the remaining 5 forward weapon starships, as well as all the remaining starships with Lieutenant Commander command seating. So basically all the starships that have 5 forward weapons, as well as all the starships that can have concentrate firepower 3 in their build. All starships that cannot fall into either of those categories are going to be D tier or lower in this tier list. Cool. Alrighty. So starting off, we're going to have the Lockbox Gemini Dreadnought Carrier. This is a starship that, you know, it's one of those classic ones for tanking. You've got solid seating here, no primary spec command, which kind of sucks for modern stuff. But you know what? It's still a solid torpedo boat. Lieutenant Commander Engineering Command does help torpedo boats for that. But you do have to be stuck with 4 science abilities on this ship if you're going to go real torpedoes with the meta right now. But you know what? It still leaves you with 6 tactical abilities. Not the end of the world, but slightly off meta. Not as bad as full Lieutenant Commander Engineering, but it's still slightly off meta because ideally for torpedo boats, you want Commander Tactical and Lieutenant Commander Tactical alongside that Lieutenant Commander Command C for Concentrated Firepower 3 alongside that. Still a good torp boat, and because of its 4-3 weapon layout, and again, it's still fine for tanking as well. Because as mentioned earlier with the other discussion about how Dreadnought carriers work with the Herc Dreadnought carrier for tanking, but no primary spec. It does hold it back a little bit. Right after him, it's gonna be the Fleet Prometheus. There's technically a different name for the Prometheus than this. Technically from the fleet, but it's basically the Prometheus. You can use the unique consoles for the Prometheus with the ships, you know, to split the ship up. Downside obviously is, you know, the console set's not meta at all. But hey, it's a solid torp boat. Not a really big standout by any means versus a lot of the other torp boats in this list, but hey, it's a 4-3 torp boat with Lieutenant Commander Engineering / Command, so you can get rid of those annoying engineering abilities for more torpedo stuff. Cool. Okie dokie. Moving on is going to be the Legendary Columbia or Legendary NX Escort. One of our escorts from the Legendary Bundle. I am putting this ship here. Technically, from a deepest potential, it does have more than the Legendary Defiant, but it's here because of its harder to use bridge offshore seating. This is one of those ships that it took me a while to learn how to actually to set her up for sure, just because I like to tank, and so this one was definitely a weirder one to learn how to tank on. The point of this ship, honestly, when I was looking at it versus the stats of the other ones, this is basically the sturdier fleet temper warship that's a little bit harder to use. It's trying to bridge the gap between the Huznok warship and what now is the Fleet Temper warships. You know, the Fleet Temper warships didn't exist when the ship came out, and of course, but they kept the NX Escort as a plain escort, which from a master package standpoint is not as good as what warships and destroyers have. So that's a knock against it, and its seating is just harder to use. So for me, I had to push it down to C tier. This is still a solid ship. But you do need to think a little bit more unconventionally for energy-based builds in terms of being able to fly this thing. Which, now that I think about it more, it's just you basically just use Photonic Officer for its builds. You use weapon and engine, merge by weapons, merge by the engines, and then you use some temporal stuff alongside full tactical from there. So it's not as bad. It's just you can't use Octobat with the Starship. It just doesn't work. Cool. Okie dokie. Moving on. Oh, there's my clicker. Is the Lockbox Herald Dreadnought Carrier. And another 4-3 Dreadnought Carrier with Lieutenant Command and Lieutenant Intel. I think we saw a seating like that before. It's C tier because Dreadnought Carriers get a bit of a decrease in terms of its stuff. But yes, this is like the Appalachia, but in Dreadnought Carrier form. For those of you all that are curious about that, it slightly worse at tanking than the Gemini Dreadnought Carrier, but slightly better at torpedo damage than the Gemini Dreadnought Carrier. Very, very solid stats. And the reason why I remember this ship is because back in the day, before Victory's Life came out, this was one of the few tier 6 starships in the game that was below 100 million energy credits on the exchange. Like it was really cheap. And then Victory's Life came out, and then the trade from this thing became meta for a while, and it went up drastically in price. And well, a lot of people saw some deep increased stuff, and so basically every tier 6 starship went up drastically in price from there. It was also because there's this huge influx in the player base in general, combined with what was happening with the meta at that time. But yeah, at one point, this ship was the cheapest tier 6 starship in the game. It's not anymore, but at one point, this ship was the cheapest tier 6 starship in the entire game. Anyway, moving on, we have the sarcophagus. Oh. This ship is pretty much the Herc Dreadnought carrier, but they intentionally made it horrible because they wanted there to be this huge gap between this ship and the promo pack Herc ship. And yeah, they made it way worse. Yeah, it's got the high hull of the Herc, smidge it less, but not by much. Slightly higher shields, which it's still lower than within the 1.1 shield ratio that I recommend for tanking, so it's still a bad shield ratio. And then you look at that mobility. Wow, you can't get worse than that in Star Trek Online. There's no ship with a lower turn rating than 4, a lower impulse than 0.13, and a lower inertia than 20. No ship is worse than this. No ship is as bad as the sarcophagus at mobility. So yeah, so those of you that happen to have a sarcophagus and we're like, why does this ship feel so horrible to fly? This is why. Like it has the objectively worst mobility of every starship in the entire game. That being said, it still has the Lieutenant Commander command. So for torpedo stuff, for tanking stuff, this ship is still technically serviceable. I do not recommend it for that. But I do have several of these because back in the day, Honor Dead was a must-have tanking trait. It's still nice to have, but it's not as needed with lots of other survival traits added to the game later than it was whenever this ship came out. All right. With that being said, I mean, Lieutenant Command and Ensign Merrick Worker is not really that impactful, to be honest. And it has that Lieutenant Command Engineering seat, which is not great for torps either. This is mainly just a tanking platform. And it's one of the worst of the Dreadnought carriers that actually still has command seating. If you're going to fly this ship, just keep in mind it has the worst mobility of the game. It feels worse than the Deredexes. So just keep that in mind. Moving on, we have an Intel Raider, which has Commander Intel, Lieutenant Merrick Worker, which I've ranked lower because it doesn't have a cloak. Why is it that Cryptic has decided that one of the worst commander specializations, that one of its signature things for the specialization is that starships with Commander Intel get a cloak if it doesn't have one, or it improves the standard cloak if it's of a faction that already has a normal cloak on the ship. Like whenever Delta Rising came out, the Klingon starships with Commander Intel were always battle cloaks. The Romney ones that had Commander Intel had enhanced battle cloaks. And Federation ones with Commander Intel had actually got cloaks built into their starships. And Cryptic decided later, nah, we're not going to fully follow that. Commander Intel objectively is like the worst commander specialization of all of them right now. So I have to rate this ship a bit lower because of that. Still solid and flexible. Nothing particularly wrong with it, and still 5 forward weapons, so it's still an okay raider. I just have a bias against Commander Intel that doesn't have cloaks, so it is here. Alongside that one is going to be the Mirador, which instead of the Intel Merrick Worker, it's Pilot Intel. So still a decent ship. Not as impactful as some other raiders can be, but it still has 5 forward weapons. It's still a reasonable starship, especially with that durability and mobility combined. When it comes to a lot of the raiders, I don't have a ton of opinions personally on a lot of the raiders, just because, I mean, wow, universal seating, wow, specialist seating, they're fairly flexible. Like, and that's one of the nice things about raiders, that they're generally pretty flexible. So unlike some of the other ships that are rated later, that like they're rated low because of their lack of flexibility and lack of specialist seating, as long as raiders got those, they're fine and will perform okay. That being said, the Mars Escort, by the way, is just the Mirador, but converted into an escort and given a battle cloak. Now it is the 32nd century battle cloak, which cloaks and decloaks a little bit faster. Do I think that's better than having the Mirador and stuff? No. I'm just gonna be realistic with you. I prefer flying the Mirador versus the Mars. Yes, the Mars looks cool. It's got that extra fun stuff that's detached from the ship, which also fortunately makes things a little bit easier on the animators, because unlike the science destroyers, they have lots of things that can break. With this ship, even if something slightly breaks, you know, those extra engines are detached from the ship. So guess what? Even if there's some slight collision issues, it's not going to be visually impacting that players are going to notice. Now they'll notice if like engine trails are like off or something, or in different spots, but in terms of some of those other significant things, it's not going to be as impactful. So it's probably why Cryptic has focused a lot on the 32nd century ships, just because from an animation standpoint, with all those detached things, there's a lot less things that they have to worry about in that sense. After them, it's going to be the Herald Raider, with no primary spec, but it's got a second raider intel, so it's still fine. Lieutenant Pilot is very inconsequential, and I don't really consider that really even part of the starship itself. Still decent stats, still decently mobile, still a decent raider. And then after that is going to be the Amari, which is basically just the destroyer variant of the Herald Raider. So for this tier list perspective, I am putting this below it. I do understand this, that if you make this as a torpedo boat, this is a very good, like, off-meta torpedo option. Now, to explain this a little bit, if you use Concentrated Firepower 3, you don't have to be the one that soaks up the stuff from Concentrated Firepower 3, basically. You can use Concentrated Firepower 3 and then have someone else actually be the torpedo boat and get all that extra stuff from all of those benefits for torpedoes. The Amari, thanks to its strong, unique console, is one of those starships that gets the benefit the most from that. Now, that of course being said, you know, I am not a torpedo DPS master like Augie. I am sure that he probably has other methods besides just this unique console as to why he loves the Amari so much for torpedo stuff. But that mechanic definitely does help with the Amari. And obviously when we talk about DPS stuff, there's obviously stuff I'm going to be overlooking with these starships, if that wasn't already obvious at this point. I still think it's a solid starship. Do I think it's worthy of it being promo? From a mechanic standpoint, probably not. It's really the onboard amenities is what lets this ship be a promo ship, in my opinion. Then again, I mean, there is a much worse destroyer in the game that's a lockbox starship. So now I didn't look at the history of Starship to see if the Crenum came out first and then they wanted to make a stronger version to put in promo packs, or if they made the strong promo Amari and then wanted to make a weaker lockbox version. I didn't look too far into it, but in my opinion, when you look at the exact same seating entirely between these two different ships, besides the fact that they switch the intel and pilot seat for the lockbox Crenum warship, I think it's clear that one influence the other when it comes to the bridge officer seating. Still decently durable otherwise, but obviously it's still less durable than the Amari. So the Crown ship is okay. Of course, the obvious problem with the Crown, it's like, if I'm going to have Lieutenant Commander Pilot and Lieutenant Intel, why am I picking this ship over the fleet warships? Like the Fleet Temporal warship, or just getting the Sea-Star Gemini Vanguard warship? I'm picking a more expensive starship that is still one of those older ones that doesn't even have a lot of the better materials anyway. It just doesn't make that much sense to me. I mean, sure, I'm sure people love this ship or something, but I just don't see much of a point for this ship. But that's just, of course, that's just my opinion. I'm not a DPS captain. There's probably people who will tell me otherwise. After that, we're going to have the mirror angle. I am putting this down here this low just to put an emphasis in comparison that the fleet version's got command seating. This ship does not. So yes, both the mirror angle and the fleet angle have, and the C-Star version of the fleet angle have similar clicky consoles. So if you're wanting different starships for that, I can definitely see it. It is Intel Temporal, which is a nice bridge officer combination. Still a 5.2 weapon layout. So if you're not going to do command stuff, this is fine. Maybe the ship should have been a little higher, but I'm putting subclass here for this. Some of these ships can definitely be moved around for sure. But all those ships are better than the C-Star Escort Mega Bundle starships. Wow, Cryptic, why did you give us 2 Pilot Escort Mega Bundles? Why couldn't we have had one of these escorts be something other than Pilot? I'm ranking them basically on par with each other. These are basically less durable Legendary Defiance on a worse chassis. And that's basically what it comes down to these ships. So they're ranking here. I am putting the original Pilot Escorts, these ones, ahead of these ones, because at least the Ramen versions here can get battle cloaks, while these ones are all like just carbon copies of each other in like every single way. You'll see in just a moment. And that these ships are also faster. So with those two things in mind, I'm putting these ones higher. Just like last video, these were designed back in time whenever the faction gates were still in the game, and that Federation ships cannot be flown by Klingons and vice versa. Same thing with Romulan ships, with all the other factions. And so the item, and so with this mug mode, they basically just made 3 different visual variants that are customizable, that had an engineering version, a tactical version, and a science version. As a tank captain, I personally prefer the engineering one the best. But all 3 of these variants have 5 base tactical consoles, so like it really just comes down to which starship's bridge officer scene do you prefer to have? If you like the engineering one the best, then pick the engineering. If you like the tactical version the best, pick the tactical version. If you like the science version best, pick the science version. In terms of base stats, obviously, the KDF one is the best for its higher hull. The Romulan version has a battle cloak, and then the Federation version has the best for Space Barbie. That being said, is there really anything other than that really that makes them super stand out? Not particularly. And again, if you're like comparing this to like the Legendary Defiant, for instance, the Legendary Defiant has almost this exact same bridge officer seating, except it's Lieutenant Universal Pilot and Lieutenant Science, instead of Lieutenant Science, Lieutenant Universal Pilot. So if you're comparing them like trying to do apples to apples, that's basically the comparison. And that obviously the Romulan version's got a battle cloak. So there's that. When we're looking at the other Mega Bundle, these are the Allied Pilot Escorts. And if you see the base stats, you might see a slight problem. There's no difference. They are literally carbon copies of each other. In modern Star Trek Online, I highly discourage buying the full Allied Pilot Escort Mega Bundle. Pick the starship that you like the best, and then just go with them. In my opinion, the Andorian ones look the best. But again, this is just a tier list today, and looks don't matter. Which means that if you actually look at my spreadsheet, I'll put up the spreadsheet whenever the engineering ships go out. But looking at them, like, they're really just the same in terms of the raw stats. And so in the actual spreadsheet, these ships all have the exact same number. A lot of the other ones have, slightly different numbers because of that base hull and shield stuff for differences. These ones, they're literally the exact same number for the three engineering versions, the three tactical versions, and the 3 science versions. The difference for these ones, honestly, because consoles doesn't matter too much, is that the science version has Lieutenant Commander Science with those 2 universal seats. The tactical version has Lieutenant Commander Tactical, and then the engineering one has Lieutenant Commander Engineering. Because these ships should, in theory, be used for weapon-based damage, like whether beams or cannons, in my opinion, the engineering one is just the best because of how the DPS scene works. You want merge powered weapons, merge powered engines, and then double aux to bat to deal with your cooldowns. And then the other versions, though, have Lieutenant Commander Tactical or Lieutenant Commander Science, which doesn't help, because if you're Lieutenant Commander Science, for instance, yeah, you've got your cooldowns handled, but you still need an extra engineering ability to have immerse power to weapons and immerse power to engines on your build. And so now for the science version, you have basically a force lieutenant or lieutenant commander engineering, and then you use the other seat for tactical. For tactical, it's kind of even worse because you still need a seat for cooldowns. So you're either going to have science and basically what it comes down to is the engineer version gives you more flexibility in terms of how you want to use the other 2 universal seats. Science and tactical just don't give you that much flexibility. You have more things you have to think about, frankly. So I view the engineering one the best, but of course that's just my biased opinion. Of course, of how I view how Star Trek Online should be played. After all of them, I have the Xindi Escort. After that, Lieutenant Commander Temporal is okay. It's not really the end of the world. It's still a reasonably durable starship. I mean, you still have the fleet temporal warships, which are just way better than this. But hey, if you want an expensive single starship, hey, it's an option, I guess. I don't recommend it, but it's technically an option. And then, of course, you've got, the NX refit, which basically is the Xindi Escort, but it's got less choices for that universal seat, because at least with the Xindi Escort, you've got your cooldowns and stuff handled. Okay, you have, because of Photonic Officer are already here, you can do either a half bat with weapons and engines, or you can just do full Photonic Officer and have weapons, engines, and a temporal ability here. And then you can have the universal C for whatever you want. You can have it for engineering if you really want to do a full aux to bat, or you do have tactical here. For the NX, you've got no choice really. You cannot make this tactical because you want to have if you're gonna have double aux to bat, you have merge power to weapons then, and then you still don't have merge power to engines in your build. So the NX refit is more forced for what has to be in this bridge officer seat here. Either it's science for Photonic Officer for your cooldowns, or you have to have engineering there for your merge power to engines ability. Cool. All right. Other than that, they're basically very, very similar ships. After that is where I would put the Cardassian Intel Escort. Again, it's an Intel primary escort, but hey, at least it's got a cloak this time, so that's nice. And it's got its cooldown stuff handled. Intel is just not as strong as Temporal, in my opinion. I view Intel as just Lieutenant Commander Intel, and its platform is not really that strong, frankly. So for me, I am putting this ship here. Although I could definitely see arguments for for other ranks of this and other ships too. After that is where I will put the Herc Strike Wing Escort. This is a starship really with just Lieutenant Commander pilots, and then flexible seating alongside it. Flexible in quotes here because with the way energy builds are, those seats have to go to engineering and or science. So you can get weapons, engines, and coolant management taken care of in your bridge officer seats. Yes, with the Boimler effect trait, this can be mitigated a little bit, but I still recommend having that other stuff regardless. And with Lieutenant Pilot, it's almost like you're not having a specialization on the ship, frankly, so not really super great. After that is the fleet's KDF Raptor. Solid ship, actually reasonable stats for a fleet starship, but with only Lieutenant Intel, I am ranking it quite a bit lower. That being said, the fleet KDF Raptor here is better than the Vaubois Soul Escort because it's literally the exact same seating, but this is a fleet starship and this is a lockbox starship without a cloak. Yes, it's a smidge faster, more maneuverable, but lockbox, fleet, lockbox, fleet, especially with cross-faction access to stuff now. If the lockbox Vaubois ship was actually appealing to you in any way, just get this ship instead. It's way cheaper. It's way cheaper for you. All right, after them is where I would put the Zinkethi Escort. Another Lieutenant Commander pilot starship that is only here because it's got high shields for durability. And they're down to 4 base tactical consoles, so that's not great either. And its base durability is the only reason why it's ahead of the Bajoran Interceptor. Both these ships are not really that strong, honestly. Not really a big fan of either ship. Honestly, I could see either of these bottoming out C tier. So if you think the Zinkethi Escort's worse than the Bajoran Interceptor, then sure, I would be like, yeah, go ahead and go for it. For me personally, I don't like because of the raw durability and seating, I don't like the Bajoran Interceptor quite as much. But hey, you know what? It's an event ship, and it still has 5 forward weapons on the Escort chassis. So you know what? It still deserves its C tier spot, even though pilot specialization stuff is not great, and there's no primary spec pilot. It's like a starship that's like, I really want pilot maneuvers, but I'm an event ship, so I can't have pilot maneuvers because of that. So it is what it is. That being said, we are out of C tier now, and now we are wandering into D tier. So as a reminder, especially for people that are skipping around in this video, D tier starships are starships with only 4 forward weapon slots, and are starships without the ability to slot Concentrate Firepower 3, which is available from the Lieutenant Commander command seat or a Commander command seat, obviously. So these are starships that are already going to be noticeably weaker than a lot of the other starships in this video. That being said, and I will note this later, a lot of these ships in D, E, and F tier are still better than a lot of the cruisers in this game. When I get to the cruiser list, I'm going to do a real royal bashing against a lot of the cruisers. So feel free to tune into that next week for that. Getting on to D tier stuff. On the top of this is going to be the Noctul Raider. This is a 4 forward weapon raider that is only here because of the really strong clicky console, the Temporal Distress Beacon. 12% crit severity, ability to potentially be immune to all damage for 30 seconds if you can protect your time duplicate, which is not hard if you're a tank. If you're a DPS captain, maybe that's a little bit more difficult, but for tanking, it's not that hard. But I mean, this is a raider, so probably shouldn't be tanking on this thing. Unfortunately, it's just a 4 weapon starship, but this console itself, for me, makes it be the top of D tier, but it's still a noticeable significant drop from the other starships for sure. Right after that is the Fleet Event Rising Pilot Corvette. Keep in mind, in this list, we actually have two different Rising Corvettes. We have the Fleet version, which does pilot maneuvers, and then the normal event version, which doesn't. The difference is that if you earn the regular Fleet version, it just has Lieutenant Commander Universal Pilot. The Fleet version, which you can buy for one Fleet module after you earn the event one, or if you bought the Rising Corvette from Mutt's Market, then you could buy the event or the Fleet version of the Rising Corvette from the Fleet. Tier 1 military, one Fleet module, and what you basically do is you get 10% higher hull and shields, which isn't much on this starship. And instead of Lieutenant Commander Universal Pilot seating, you have Commander Pilot and Lieutenant Pilot. So for some DPS players, they actually consider this a DPS decrease over the regular version, because generally speaking, for the meta, you basically have to make this universal seat science or engineering. As a tank captain, I prefer this route to go engineering here, because not all broadsiding builds need 6 tactical abilities, so this just gives me a little bit of extra freedom in the tactical seats too. But I definitely get it. A lot of people don't like this ship because of that. It is the fastest escort in the game. The reason why it gets this spot here is because something that most people don't know about with the Rising Corvette is that it gets a speed defense bonus. So it gets extra defense based upon like how high you're throttling and how fast that you're going. Because of that, this is actually one of the off-meta tanks to actually pick, because you actually have extra defense, and for being a regular escort, you have you still keep that defense in your mastery package as well. So you don't have the teeth of other subclasses, but you have something extra cool and unique that is here versus a lot of the other escorts. So I feel that it deserves that spot here. I totally get it. If you don't care about the speed defense bonus, then yeah, this is still one of the worst escorts. But it's still, for me, it's still an okay ship. After that, we get to the C-Store 31st Century Temporal Raider. Again, this is essentially a bird of prey, but they named it differently so that at the time Federation captains could also access it, because they made those 31st Century starships so that they were fully cross faction at a point when everyone was like fully united as one faction. Because this is actually a bird of prey, even though it's listed as just a plain raider because it's cross faction, whatever. It's full universal seating, which means you have one less total bridge officer ability on the starship, which means you only have 12 instead of 13 bridge officer abilities. That being said, it is fully universal with Commander Temporal, which means if, and I don't recommend this, but if you're going to go and do exotic damage on a raider or on an escort in general, this is the starship to choose. Now, that being said, in my personal opinion, scout ships, in terms of a lot of their base stats and things, were initially designed from this particular starship itself inside the game. Because Christian was also seeing that there are people flying the starship and doing science stuff on it. And they're like, huh, maybe there's a market to make a new subclass for science vessels and make it full universal seating pretty much. And boom, a few years later, we finally got scout ships. It's still an okay ship, and it's still flexible, and it's got Commander Temporal, so that's still an okay starship. That being said, you know, outside of that science stuff, like it's not something that really sticks out personally. But still, it's a full spec, and for full flexibility, it's not a horrible starship by any means. I still consider it a smidgen above the low temporal destroyers. Keep in mind, if you're going to do broadsiding, these ships are still perfectly fine inside the game. It's kind of funny that, you know, after I mentioned in my Starship comparisons video for the fleet temporal warships that I was like, oh, hey, the low temporal destroyers are now like completely worthless because these other ships are just better. And then lo and behold, a little while later, Cryptic decided to buff the temporal destroyers and temporal science vessels. and made the temporal science vessel, the lockbox temporal science vessel, basically the best exotic boat in the game. But these ships are still fine. They're literally carbon copies of each other if you're looking at the three things, just like the lockbox temporal science vessels. It is what it is. It's still a science capable escort if you want that. It's still a capable broadsiding starship as well. Because you basically have to broadside with this thing to do as effective as like the Huslock warship, it does have that marking down for me personally. You can still do quite well in this starship. You still can do quite well. But no 5 forward weapons does hurt the ship. And so for me, it has to go down into D tier because of that. Cool. Okie dokie. Moving on, we have the Fleet Theseus temporal escort. People generally pick this starship not for its stats, but because they want a TOS era escort, and it's dilithium TOS skin is, a TOS skin makes you look like an escort from the TOS era. So TOS captains that want a TOS look by Commander Tactical, this is like a great option to pick. Generally speaking, this is just a fleet low by temporal destroyer, but again, people pick this ship for its looks for the TOS skin rather than the actual stats of the ship itself. It's still very, very workable. If you want to do scatter vol, you can, but you don't have 5 forward weapons, so I consider that a big downgrade. It's still an okay workable ship though. After that, we get to the Undine Battle Warship. Another pilot starship, which sucks. Oh, and I mess up the stats on this. The stats of this is actually different. I copied this from a different slide. But it is a pilot intel starship. For sure, I'll just need to change the stats later. It is 4 forward weapons without command seating, and it actually is reasonably durable. So there is that to consider for sure. Because I messed up the stats, I can't talk about that in detail. So moving on, we have the legendary Burrell pilot bird of prey. This is one of the big disappointments for in my opinion, for a lot of the community. A lot of us wanted the legendary Burrell to have 5 forward weapons. And same thing with the legendary Derricks. We'll get to that in the next video, but the pattern that we've been seeing for a while in Star Trek Online is that Cryptic is willing to buff Federation starships, but they're unwilling to significantly buff the off Federation starships. Like it's almost like Cryptic wants this self-fulfilling prophecy that they don't want non-Federation ships to be flown, so that they can continue to say to themselves, we don't no, the non-Federation ships don't sell. They aren't flown, so obviously we can't make more of them. I'm telling you right now, like if you make really, really good Klingon starships, people will fly them. As long as people know about them. Now, the Fleet Garamba, I think, is one of the situations that, people just didn't realize that it was good. And so people are flying the veteran destroyers instead. But this is one of those, like, people were looking forward to for, like, okay, 10th Federation Legend Burrell had 10 Federation ships, great. So next year, we're going to get a super good Burrell, right? No. And I mean, like, here's the thing. If this ship was a 4-2 weapon layout, but it was Commander Pilot and Lieutenant Commander Command, it would have actually been a great ship. Because in the modern torpedo meta, the prevailing thought is to have 4 forward weapons and then as many rear weapons as possible. So, and especially with a starship that has a standard enhanced battle cloak, it would have made sense to have Commander Pilot if they really wanted to have pilot maneuvers, and then give a Lieutenant Commander Command for the stealth bomber battle cloaking stuff with the ship. But it's got no command scene, so it can't do that quite as well. And well, only 4 forward weapons, and so this was a very, very big disappointment. Well, at least it was a big disappointment to me. At least my impression is that it was a big disappointment to the entire community, especially when later legendary ships would get buffed in its weapon layout. And it's like, why couldn't you do it with these other ships? But anyway, still pilot and intel, which makes it still okay. And it is flexible seating. Enhanced battle cloak does help it out in the rankings a little bit. And it is very maneuverable. If you're wanting to fly a Burrell, this is an okay option. Keep in mind though, I need to make this as a big note here. For me, the fleet Discovery pilot raters are basically just as good. They're pretty much the same, which is really sad to say. But for me, they're basically just about on the same level. They get an extra bridge officer seat, which to me is about the same as if you had that intel seating that the legendary Burrell has. Similar maneuverability as well. So I just hope that well, I don't know. Yes, they finally did give this bird of prey a modern skin, but it was a limited time skin, which really the C-Star version should have just had the skin. Just me throwing that out there. Still maneuverable, still all right. Again, if you want space proper, you pick a Federation version of any starship that is a Discovery era starship. The Kalina version you just pick because of a battle cloak, and that's it. Moving on, we have the Sphere Builder Dreadnought carrier. It has 4 science seats, which is not cool. That being said, it is Commander Temporal. And it has Lieutenant Engineering / Command, so it is still going to be a reasonable tanking platform for a Dreadnought carrier. So if you're wanting to do that, this is still an okay option. You just have to deal with 4 science abilities, which is not which is not super ideal. And so because of that, it is a little bit harder to set up, but you can set it up to make it do okay. And yes, technically in my slide, I said without command seating. When I'm saying this for these slides, I mean without Lieutenant Commander command seating, because for torpedo builds, it's like concentrate firepower 3, or don't worry about torpedoes at all on the platform, or have someone else with concentrate firepower 3, and then you do the torpedoes. All right. With that being said, let's move on. We have the Fleet Fayette next. It's another starship that it's starting to show its age, but it still looks all right. It's really just its stats that hold it back personally. Actually, I think in one of these Star Trek Picard comics, I think this is one of the ships that actually showed up in prelude to the show. Picard was flying an Odyssey class, and a Fayette showed up. So at least for the Star Trek lore, this is actually a decently old ship. So there is that. Maneuverable. It's got enhanced battle cloak because it's got commander intel, and so it's an okay ship. Its lack of 5.4 weapons is what holds the ship back. Cool. Okie dokie. Moving on, it's going to be the Event Breen warship, which I do rank a little bit higher than the Fleet Recon Destroyers just because of the base stats. But they're both very comparable in their stuff that they are giving you. Still decent maneuverable. 4 tactical consoles is not great, but hey, you know what? It is what it is. It's an event starship that's actually reasonably flexible for what it's doing for you. It's okay. This is definitely not something you need to like go out of your way for to get from a Phoenix token stuff. There's way better options for that. Like the Bajoran ship, like you don't buy the Phoenix token of the Bajoran ship to get it to fly. You get that one for the console. And the British ship doesn't really have something like that, so it is where it is in the list. The Fleet Recon Destroyers got a little bit more teeth, but they're a little less flexible in my opinion, so they're a little bit lower for me personally. These are, as noted earlier in the video, The Federation and Klingon version are actually a lot older than the Romulan and Jem'Hadar Vanguard version. So that is something to keep in mind. Because of that, they had to make the Romulan version have the exact same stats as the other two. But they made the Jem'Hadar version actually have meaningfully less hull, because that would not have been as balanced for a cryptic standpoint, because the wingman mechanic means that it shouldn't be as durable as the other ships. It's still an okay starship, but I would way prefer having Commander Tactical Temporal over Lieutenant Commander Intel. Just me and my personal biases here, so I would still rank the temporal warships way higher, and I would still rank, you know, the low buy temporal destroyers way higher too. Even though, yes, if you're doing broadsiding versus the low buy temporal destroyers, these are much more affordable. Still are a great match package subclass, so nothing inherently super bad about them. And after that, we get to the the promo Jem'Hadar Escorts. I was thinking low buy because one of the versions actually showed up in a low buy store for a while. There's two different variants. There's the strike ship and the recon ship. The strike ship does not look as cool as the recon ship, but most people don't care about the seating of these ships. Honestly, people pick these ships for its trading console. Go for the kill for cannon rapid fire builds is very potent. Generally speaking, if you don't have that trait for cannon rapid fire, the general recommendation is to go scatter volley for cannon based builds anyway. The console is a nice filler crit severity console. If you happen to get the Muds Market bundle that gave you a Jem'Hadar Escort, that's a filler crit severity console that you can use in place of a low buy crit severity console if you wish in your build. Just something to keep in mind in case you happen to have that account locked across your account. Otherwise, they're single character promo ships, which, I mean, for escorts, especially for the time, they were very durable. Nowadays, we have, you know, warships and destroyers and stuff with similar or higher durability, and have more teeth behind them too. But for its durability and for its mobility, they're still solid ships. Unfortunately, no 5-4 weapons, so that does hurt them a little bit overall, in my opinion. So yep, there is the stuff for that, and I personally prefer the original version versus the recon ship. Although the recon ship, you know, it has pilot intel, which, again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, are these stronger specializations for PvP. So them plus Miracle Worker are the ones that you would want for PvP. Temporal, a little bit less so. Cool. Okie dokie. Moving on, we get to the Mogai / Valdor / Morgu, whatever name you want to call this starship. If Cryptic gives us a Miracle Worker Warbird with 5 forward weapons, this is probably the ship. I was a little disappointed that the Legendary Directs didn't have 5 forward weapons because, well, Federation and Klingon captains both have a 5 forward weapon Miracle Worker starship for them, while the Romulans don't yet. Hopefully they will in the future, and hopefully it is the legendary Valdor. We will see if Cryptic ever decides to release the legendary Valdor. I would say probably within like the next year and a half, if Star Trek Online can survive the next year, then I see this as likely. We will see in time though. The ship is still a solid ship. It's actually very durable for its maneuverability, which is why I consider it a destroyer, even though it still has the tactical warbird mastery package. So many warbirds have the exact same mastery package. Warbirds have the same issue that science vessels have, honestly, and that a lot of them have the exact same mastery package, when it's like, these ships are clearly based on like other starships. So it's, I don't know. I wish warbirds had said the various different mastery packages, or they just copy the mastery packages of the starships that they're trying to be, and just had the singularity circuitry stuff built into the singularity core, so they could have a regular mastery package. Cryptic, if you're listening, I would definitely prefer that over the way you're currently doing things, but I understand that would be a lot of warbirds to go through and to fix, so that's probably not a high priority. Anyway, still great stats. Lieutenant Commander Intel is not the best, but it's not the worst. And after that, we get to some really not so great starships. And it's not because these starships are inherently bad, but I like never talk about these on these starship comparisons videos because these aren't realistic for most players to ever want to seek out. Because the Alliance Escorts, oh yes, the Romulan version has slightly different stats, which is weird because it's actually the better ship with a lower starship or a fleet military. But the Phrasian Escort and the Cajun Escort are starships that require tier 5 military. Now, in some senses, I can understand where they're coming from here, because these ships are similar to the Gemini Escorts in terms of their durability and maneuverability. But we have better ships now than these ships now, available at much lower starship, or for a much lower fleet mastery. Yeah. So if you're wanting a ship that's durable and maneuverable, we have way better ships to choose from now. Additionally, the Dalen Warbird, also part of this C-Store bundle thing, has higher hull, which generally speaking in modern Star Trek Online is better, and it only requires tier 4 military instead of tier 5 military of these two starships. So to me, the Romulan Warbird version is the objective better option over these two ships. Both of them look cool, and I'm not going to deny that both ships look cool. But the fleet military requirement to the benefits you're getting out of it just are not worth it in the slightest to me personally. So they have to be ranked this low in my personal tier list. Yes, and I get it, you know, it is what it is, but, you know. That being said, you know, there's another cheaper starship, which is the Phantom Intel Escort, another fast starship that doesn't require quite as high fleet military. And it's a Commander Intel starship, so there's that. I don't like the birds are seeing quite as much, but you know, if you like it, you're more than welcome to pick this ship instead. Still a solid ship regardless as well, and it looks a little bit better too. After that, we have the TLDR Adaptive Destroyer. This isn't technically as bad as a lot of the other ships here, but this is a CounterYolo warning to you all. This ship does have sensor analysis, and so a lot of people get trapped into thinking that they can make an off-meta exotic build with this starship. Okay, so let's just go through this for a moment. Like, if you actually made these two seats science, you would have 8 science abilities. But here's the problem: what are you going to use these 5 tactical abilities for? Just realistically speaking here, okay, maybe 3 like abilities for enhancing torpedoes, but you've got no concentrate firepower 3 on the starship, so you can't even really do a pseudo side torp off meta stuff on the starship. And so for me, realistically, I just see this as you're trying to do science on a starship with 5 dead abilities, and so in reality, you shouldn't be building this like a science vessel, not in the slightest. Pick the C-Store or Orbital's Temporal Raider if you're actually wanting to do pseudoscience stuff on an escort. Just throwing that out there. Way cheaper, and will get you miles farther, frankly. And you won't be like banging yourself against the wall, being like, what am I supposed to do with these abilities when there's just a way cheaper, way better option for you if you really want to do that type of playstyle. Cool. Okie dokie. That being said, you know, it's still a destroyer. It still has decent seating for if you want to do regular weapon damage. It's still a solid ship. Just that you shouldn't be falling into that trap of doing exotic damage on this ship, because that's not what this ship is for. Cool. Okie dokie. Now that I've made my peace with that, let's go ahead and move on. I think this might be the bottom of the list. No, we still have 2 ships after this, but the bottom of the regular stuff for escorts, we have the Vorgon Escort. Another reasonably durable, reasonably maneuverable starship. that is just another Lieutenant Commander Intel starship. Fortunately, the positioning is a bit more flexible for doing stuff, but again, it's a 4-3 escort, so not quite as impactful as what other ships can be, but hey, it's better than the E tier escorts. So there's that. You don't even need to seek this out. I know that some people, and I will make this random comment here, some people feel that if you're trying to make the Orville in Star Trek Online, that this escort's the closest in terms of looks that you can get to that. I don't fully agree. I think there's another ship that's probably a little closer, but I can see some of the similences between this ship and that if you pick the right vanity shield for you. Anyway, with that said, we will be rounding this out with our last two Dreadnought carriers for D tier. Our first one is going to be the Fecalari Dreadnought carrier. Why is it D tier? Because it has 7 weapons, and it doesn't have a primary specialization here, and no command seating. And so because of my personal biases on the matter, this thing is going to is ranked this low. It is still a solid ship. If you want to do broadsiding with this thing, it still serves quite well with 2 hangar bays. And so for a lot of you, especially if you aren't going to do like ISA, IC stuff and want your hangar base to support you, this is still a solid ship because, you know, the Lost Souls hangar pets are still solid pets. So it's a totally fine platform. That being said, the Zindi's platform, in my opinion, is a bit less so of a thing. Sure, and Intel seating is nice. Lieutenant Command, not quite as much, especially considering you're probably gonna need to use that for your for your coolant management anyway with Photonic Officer. So it's really just a Lieutenant Command Intel seat that you're probably gonna need to tank on. If you're trying to get the miles that you would want out of the thing versus other escorts in the game. Intel's not quite as strong for tanking as other things, and so I've ranked this quite a bit lower. You can still do reasonable damage on this thing, but that is not where its strength comes in the slightest. And it's still reasonably maneuverable for a Dreadnought carrier. All right, with that said, we're venturing into E territory. These starships are going to be starships that, what's a nice word to put this? Have very, very weak specialization seating alongside all the other stuff that would have put them into D territory to start off with. To put it in simple terms, these are our Lieutenant Commander pilot starships. That they don't get pilot maneuvers, and that pilot specialization is generally weak in PvE to begin with. So these are basically our 4 forward weapon Lieutenant Commander pilot starships inside the game. I also have 1 Lieutenant Intel escort in here too, but for the most part, it's just pilot starships that don't have pilot maneuvers. So these ships, at least when it comes to escorts, are about as weak as if, you know, you just picked a tier 5 starship and made and just upgraded it. Like, it wouldn't be that much, like they're not that much stronger than like tier 5U and tier 5X escorts inside the game. Just gonna put that out there. These ships aren't like worse than like the lower tier of cruisers, but they are still weaker in reference to other escorts. To start off with, we're going to have the regular event Rising Corvette, which again is just Lieutenant Commander pilot and no pilot maneuvers, which for me puts it into E territory. Again, if you don't like pilot maneuvers, then the fleet version would also fall into E territory as well. It's a speed defense bonus of the ship itself that keeps it at the tippity top of E tier. If you don't care about the speed defense bonus, then obviously, you know, you should be picking a different starship. After that, we have the Fleet Burrell, which has an enhanced battle cloak and flexible seating, and that's what keeps it here. Remember, the Fleet Burrell requires tier 5 fleet military. So for a lot of players, like that's part of the reason why a lot of players bought the legendary Burrell, just because tier 5 fleet military isn't realistic for a lot of players. Even though, yes, you can ask around to get stuff, I'm going to be realistic with you all. A lot of Star Trek players are not very social. So, and even like before I started making this channel, I wasn't super social. It was just me over time trying to help players that I became slightly more social inside the game. My social has more of left the game now and is more of outside the game where I talk to people now, because my channel does okay versus other Star Trek online people, but you know, it is what it is. Only Lieutenant Commander pilots means this isn't strong. It's the enhanced battle cloak is what keeps it here over another raider like the Gemini Vanguard raider, which another Lieutenant Commander pilot starship with only 4 forward weapons, and it's the wingman mechanic that keeps it higher above the next starship. You should be starting to see a pattern, by the way, and why I'm not going super in depth into these different starships. Next one is the Event Brain Raider. The same thing, but no wingman mechanic, and so it is lower tier than that. Not really too much more to say beyond that, honestly. Wish I had more to say, but like, they're all raiders with a Lieutenant Commander pilot. All pretty much the same. Similar stats, similar maneuverability. I don't really see much of a difference between them, honestly. After that, we have the Fleet Devaro, which is another Lieutenant Commander pilot that has an enhanced battle cloak. So that's what keeps it here, in my opinion. And again, as a reminder, the Romulan Republic Warbirds do not have access to Raider flanking. They do not have access to anything like that. So having an enhanced battle cloak is as close as they can possibly get to being like a Raider. So for me, this is like the Romulan version of the Raider, without needing to have intel seating, but pilot seating still really sucks. So it goes here for me personally. And then after that, we get the Gemini Strike Wing Escort, which again, after Raiders, after what I consider personally Raiders, this is like our next strongest option. It's a Strike Wing Escort with those limitations in place. It also has Lieutenant Intel. Lieutenant Intel isn't quite that great, honestly, but also you also need to factor in as well. Realistically, you'll probably want to just use weapon and engines. Merge-fired weapons and merge-fired engines for that Lieutenant engineering seats. So unless you want to sacrifice that Lieutenant Commander Universal seat for another engineering seat, which is not ideal, by the way, you're realistically going for this ship without the intel seating. So with that context in mind, it is weaker than the other ones to me. After that, we get to some interesting starships. Starships which I've mentioned on the channel before. And before making this video, or before making the spreadsheet that made my original super long video and then these 3 different parts, these were the starships that I was slightly confused on. I was like, why do these 3 different starships have way different bridge offers when they're really meant to be basically the same starship? Because it was something that was weird that I didn't really see anywhere else in the game for the other starships. And by the way, for those of you that realize how old and neglected these ships are, the Fleet Kin and the Fleet Archif both have their old names for what Strike Wing Escorts used to be called. The Romulan ones used to be called Tactical Carrier Warbirds. The Klingon version used to be called Flight Deck Raptors. I don't know why Cryptic didn't want to update the names of those 2 ships, but those 2 ships still have their old names. I don't know why. But after I was looking at the stats, and obviously looking at the stats of like all the other like 294 tier 6 starships that have full stats in the game, it finally clicked with me as to what these 3 ships are and why they're different. And so I'm now going to move to the next slide and add 1 word to each of these starships. And now it should be clear as to what these 3 starships are. The Federation version is the tactical version. The Kin is the engineering version. And the Romulan version is the science version of these Lieutenant Commander Pilot Strike Wing Escorts, which is super, super cool, actually. It's not something that I've actually seen anywhere else in the game, but it's cool that that Cryptic did this in the past. Unfortunately for Cryptic, they did this, and I can tell you this 100% because these are really old starships, and the cross factions that was very recent. They released these ships back in a time when cross faction wasn't really a thing, and so having slightly different bridge offers for the different factions probably didn't go over too well with the player base. Of course, Lieutenant Commander Pilot isn't really that strong with specialization to begin with, but having different specialization stuff probably didn't go over too well with the player base that were, are still mostly Federation. They're like, why does the Klingon version have double Lieutenant Commander seats and I don't? But if this was released nowadays, we'd be like, oh, that's actually pretty cool. Different factions actually having different bridge officer seating. That's really cool. I think it would be really cool if Cryptic did stuff like this going forward. But obviously, Cryptic did this once, and they've never done it again. Hi, Cryptic. If you're watching this video, if you're going to release starships that are similar, like for Federation Klingon version that's meant to be basically the same ship, why not switch out the bridge offer seating a little bit between the different versions? Preferably making the Klingon version maybe a little bit better, based upon your DPS testers internally in Cryptic over the Federation version, so that people are more enticed to fly the Klingon version. It'd be cool if it was more like that. But at the moment, that's not how it currently works. So it would be nice if Cryptic did this more in the future. And again, whenever they did this in the past, it was with a starship that would clearly not be that strong. Because, let's look at this for a moment. I mean, what we have are starships that, have just Lieutenant Commander Pilot, which isn't that great to begin with. And it's on a starship chassis, which, Escorts are still good, but with Pilot, it's not as good as other things could be inside the game. For me personally, I like the Romulan version the best. It's still weird still seeing tactical carrier warbird inside the game, but having Lieutenant Commander Pilot does still hurt the ship. But hey, this concept is really cool. I hope at some point Cryptic brings this back. So yeah, hopefully someday they do. Until then, we'll have to deal with more Federation and Klingon starships and Romulan starships maybe having the exact same stats, bridge officer and everything, just being literal clones of one another, to the point that there isn't really going to be as much of a point to buying all 3 variants or 4 variants. All right, me getting off my soapbox now. Let's move on to the event Fekulari warship. Starship that's very, very similar to the Strike Me Escorts from earlier, except it's just a warship now. So you don't have to have the hangar bay, and you don't have lots of other stuff to make up for that either. So it's still a strong base mastery package, because getting crit severity over defense is still nice. But you basically have to do broadsiding with this thing, really. And that's not the end of the world. But it'd be nice if there was something a little better. But I mean, thinking back on, what are these ships really meant to be? When you look at the Fekulari line in general, they're not meant to be meta. They're meant to be fun and cool and edgy, and they definitely do that. But from a performance perspective, I don't think they just measure up to a lot of the other starships, or at least a lot of the other escorts inside of the game. After that is where I would personally put the fleet's flying. Only Lieutenant Commander Pilot. It's on the tactical pilot, which isn't really that impactful, to be honest. Very weak specialization. Not really that great on stats either. Not really too impressive to me. And you need, well, I think it's only like tier 3 fleet militaries we need for this guy in order to get him. So a little bit easier to access, but there's way better ships you can get at that fleet military for sure instead of this ship. If you want it for the looks, you can get it, but if you can afford it, just get the 10th versus legendary bundle and just fly the legendary Defiant instead. way easier to fly with pilot maneuvers and has much more teeth to it as well. Coming towards the bottom of this list is the Lockbotch Alachi Escort. Now, for those of you who played through the Romulan story, would have flown one of these ships for a very short period of time. Never in combat, but for a very short period of time, for one of the missions, you basically took over one of these ships and went to an Alachi base to rescue some people. Very cool design. The Alachi ships all have really cool designs. The Alachi story has some, well, had some really cool things behind it. Really the best story Cryptic has ever really written. I mean, Victory Life is still really good because it ties into DS9 for sure. And the acting there was phenomenal, but the Romulan story was actually really well done. The visuals don't hold up as well, but the actual story itself, very intriguing, very good. This ship is another one of those starships that has double pilot seating, but Cryptic wouldn't let it have pilot maneuvers. So that sucks. Like, basically in comparison, this ship is basically the Bajoran Interceptor, but it is a 4-3 weapon layout instead of the 5-2 of the Bajoran Interceptor, to put it in comparison. That is what this ship is, and so it gets to be towards the very bottom of E tier. And the controversial ship that I'm going to put below it is the Hazari Destroyer, which only has Lieutenant Intel seating. Not the worst thing in the world, but only having a Lieutenant Specialist seat for me means it's going to be here, even though technically a lot of the Lieutenant Commander pilot stuff is still weaker than this. For my own personal rules I've been doing for this video, and I will be doing for a lot of the cruiser stuff in the next video, based upon my own internal rules, the ship has to go here. You could definitely make the ship work a lot easier than a lot of the other ships above this, but for my rules, it just has to be here. It still has reasonable stuff, but a lot of stuff is just outscaled this in like every stretch of the imagination. All right. With that being said, what do I consider the Abomination, the worst escort in the entire game at the moment? Well, fortunately for a lot of you, this is an event starship. So this is something that a lot of you probably don't even have access to and won't get tricked into flying, which is the Ferengi warship. Now, is this warship completely terrible? No. What hurts this ship more than anything, alongside having Lieutenant Commander Pilot, it has 5 forced science abilities, which is higher than any other escort in the game. Yes, there are other escorts which you can purposely have more than 5 for sure. But this one only has 5 forced science abilities. It has 5 forced, and if you're trying to do an off meta exotic build with this thing, you only can have 6. And this unique console is a boost to exotic damage, and so it'll trick players to go in exotic on this thing. Which, you know, just like a TLDR destroyer earlier, as I was mentioning, I ranked low because it's a starship which can trick players into building incorrectly. This is another starship, which due to its unique console and its seating, it can trick players to building incorrectly. That being said, if you build correctly on this starship, as my big FYI over there in the box, if this was in the crew. All right, hi everyone. Looks like when I was like looking over stuff, it looks like the last little part of this video got corrupted. So just as an FYI to like summarize at the end of that, basically the Ferengi ship is an F tier starship, but if we put this into the cruiser class list, this ship would still be a solid broadsiding C tier starship. So it is still a solid ship. It's definitely on the low end for escorts. Definitely the lowest for me personally, but versus broadsiding with like how cruisers are, the Ferengi warship is still a very solid ship. So if you're curious about, you know, should I really drop this ship and go for a better higher tier escort or a better higher tier cruiser? Not really. I mean, there are, like, as I'll go into a lot of detail next week, the cruiser, like the difference between an S tier cruiser and an E tier, an A tier and E tier cruiser is very, very drastic. There's a lot more variance over there. But anyway, sorry about that technical hiccup for you all. As for TLDR, this is the slide for all of them. There are just a lot of escorts in the game, so there's just a lot of them. They're going to be a lot better, and then especially for a lot of the older ones in the game. That being said, there still are a lot of good escorts inside the game, including a couple of them like the Fleet Karamba, which was a really, really pleasant surprise. That's one of the really, really, really old ships in the game. It's actually still really, really good. And of course, I mean, there's still the Lobai Huznok warship, which is also really old and still holds up really, really well today. Anyway, of course, then again, because I have biases around, you know, regular energy damage alongside torpedoes, and especially with tanking as a big consideration for this list. I know that my list will look a lot different than people who only care about just the raw deeps from their actual starships. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion that a lot of other people are going to have with this particular list, as to what things that they prefer higher or lower than others. I've learned a ton going through and reading the comments on Reddit and here on YouTube, even though I may had some technical hiccup and it was too quiet last time. So hopefully this video is not as bad as that. It's a good thing why I reviewed this video, because I lost the last few minutes of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. But basically, the video next week is going to be substantially longer than this one. If y'all notice, like the science vessel video wasn't super long. It was over an hour, but it's not super, super long. And this video is like a little bit over 2 hours, like 2.5 hours-ish, you know. But I went over the certain time limit that I normally have for videos for YouTube that I'm allowed to upload for. And that means I've got a lot to talk about for cruisers. So I hope that you'll join me for that next week. It's going to be a very, very long, spicy video, because, you know, I'm a tank captain. And so when I see cruisers that are really struggling and terrible, I will have a lot to say about them. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Again, this is just part 2 of the series. Part 3 will be out next week, and as long as the comments continue going awesome the way they were for the Science Vessel video, I definitely expect to have a 4th video at some point later on as well, going over the things that I've learned and how those different learnings have affected my personal tier list of how I would rank the starships myself. But anyway, thanks for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day and week.